Activision Radio.
Good evening. The tape library is taking a short break until the latter half of January. But in the meantime, I've been asking all of you to vote for your favourite episodes of 2025, so we will be revisiting your favourites here. First up, we'll be listening to the episode that came in third place. This is The Strange Case of Jeff, the Talking Mongoose. I'm going to ask you to suspend your disbelief, because what's happened here is unbelievable. It's a story filled with ludicrous ideas, a story that doesn't make sense at times, but nonetheless a story that was apparently very real to one family, their neighbours, and those who dared to come and see what was happening for themselves. But it's a story you need to hand yourself over to, and let it take you where it needs to go. In the world of the strange, this one is rather unique. In 1932, famed psychic researcher Harry Price was not in the best of circumstances. Price had gained a certain level of notoriety over the years for exposing fraudulent claims of psychic abilities and the paranormal. Most notably at this point, debunking William Hope's famous spirit photographs. He found himself stuck between two worlds, a science-based one and a spiritualist one. The various psychical research institutes that had sprung up over the years were not thrilled with Price's connection to spiritualist groups, while the spiritualists saw him as a skeptic, intent on destroying their work. He was also a key part in the formation of what would become the British Film Institute, a detail that will become important later. It was sometime early that year that Price was sitting alone in his study, flicking through letters and articles, looking for a new case. Something to really sink his teeth into, when he came across something that caught his attention. A letter from a woman named Florence Milburn. The letter was referring to an incident that had not happened to her, but to someone who was living on a nearby farm. Apparently the local area had been abuzz with rumours and wild claims that were taking place. The letter read, "Dear Sir, I beg you to forgive me for presuming on your valuable time and attention, but I feel sure you will be interested, from a scientific point of view, in what I tell you. In the heart of the country, between Glen Main and Dalby, is a small farmhouse occupied by a Mr. and Mrs. Irving and one daughter. Last September, they noticed a strange animal in their farmyard amongst the fowls, similar to a weasel. Sometime after that, they began to hear a very loud thumping on the wooden partitions. On hearing the knocking, Mr. Irving spoke, calling it to stop, and was surprised on hearing it speak back. Price was instantly intrigued and decided to get in touch with the family, and so began one of the strangest paranormal tales of all time. What started as a genuinely creepy tale took Price and many others into a rabbit hole they could have never expected. Get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. It's time to talk about one of my favourite ghost stories, if you can call it that, of all time. This is The Strange Case of the Derby Spook, or, as it's sometimes known, the story of Jeff, the Talking Mongoose. I think it's worth going back a little in time, because according to some of the locals, the moment the Irvings arrived wasn't exactly the start of the strange activity in the area. Our story takes place at Dawlish Cushen, a remote farm on the Isle of Man, which for those not familiar is an island situated on the Irish Sea between Ireland and England. The farm, particularly today, isn't easy to get to. Situated away from the nearest village up a steep hill, and is said to be around 70 acres in size. The area appears to have its fair share of local ghost stories and folklore. One story from early in the 1900s tells of men digging in the area and discovering a flat stone. When they pulled it up, beneath was an urn containing ashes. The two men who discovered it decided to bury it in the ground below a hedge bank, moving it from its original position. Sometime after this, a young man was hunting rabbits with his dog, when he saw a small furry animal dart under the hedge. The man reached in, pulling at the dirt under the hedge where he was convinced the animal had burrowed itself and was now cornered. He had no idea he was pulling up the ground that now housed the urn. Suddenly, he fell backwards, falling to the ground. The man froze for a moment and righted himself back up to continue digging, certain that he had just lost his balance, when all of a sudden he was pushed back again, more violently this time. It was enough to spook him to such an extent that he ran back to the village. Another local around this time reports walking alone one night towards Dalby. This man claims he was followed for 3 miles by something strange, a voice, but with no one else around. The voice sung hymns to him and berated him, telling him he needed to live a better life. When the man reached a hill that led up to Dawlish Cashen, he claimed that he felt like he was being pushed towards it, but the man resisted and rushed back home. Others spoke of strange animals that haunted the land, but not in specific details. It was a strange choice for James Irving to buy Dawlish Cashen. The man had been living in Liverpool with his wife Margaret and their 2 children, Elsie and Gilbert. James would be described as a cosmopolitan man. He was often well dressed, lived in a nice house, and had an interest in multiple languages. He worked for a piano company that was based in Canada, and at times would travel as part of his role as a sales agent. However, this all fell apart during the First World War, and James was forced to try his hand at a few different trades, before strangely coming across Dawlish Cashen in November of 1916. He invested some of what he had left of his savings, £310, on this remote farm despite having no experience of farming. The house was old. Irving believed it was around 130 years old at the point he purchased it, but some experts claim that the construction points to it being much older than that, potentially medieval. Previously, the estate had belonged to a French refugee named Pierre Baume, a rather eccentric character according to the locals, and one who, some suggested, still haunted the land. Initially, it appears Irving had no intention of living there. He knew it would require a decent amount of work to get it up and running, but he intended to turn it into a working farm once again. However, when his other attempts at a new career failed, James moved to the island with his wife and daughter Elsie, staying at a nearby cottage while the renovation work was complete. However, the first of the workers James hired didn't stay for long. In May of 1917, James had hired 2 men from the nearby town of Peel to work on the house. Rather than them having to walk the long and difficult trek to the farm, he had arranged for them to stay there while working. On the second night, both men came to James's cottage to tell him they were leaving. When he asked why, they said they had another job to do in town that night. But years later, the 2 men would confess to Irving the real reason. One of the men had been hearing strange sounds the entire time they had been there, as well as a feeling he described as uncanny. He didn't get into specifics, but whatever he was experiencing was enough for them to walk the 4 miles back into town in the middle of the night, rather than stay in the house a second longer. James's son Gilbert took over the initial running of the farm, and the family moved in on September of 1917. But after several years of working on the lonely farm in the middle of nowhere, both Gilbert and Elsie moved back to the mainland. Luckily, Margaret and James were not left totally alone, as in March of 1918, Margaret had given birth to another daughter named Vori. The farmhouse was isolated, dark throughout all times of the day, and the family at times wouldn't receive a visitor for months on end. It was a lonely existence seemingly, but James at least didn't seem to mind too much, and would happily make conversation with anyone he met in the local area, attempting to integrate himself as best as he could, but still looking for a higher quality of conversation than he thought the local farmers could provide by joining the local Freemasons. His daughter and wife, however, were more reserved. The family was sometimes viewed as a little strange by the locals, calling them eccentric, some even cruelly describing Margaret as witch-like, although this characteristic would be echoed by some investigators in the future. A big part of this though is that they were outsiders. In a rural area full of people who had lived on the island their whole lives. These were well-spoken city folk from the mainland. Some thought that James in particular acted like he was above some of the locals. Writers on this topic have noticed the echoes of how witches were treated in the olden days. Often they were simply people who lived further away from the community, who maybe behaved a little strangely compared to what the locals were used to. And of course, many of those witches were said to have familiars. Small animals that could do their bidding. And it wouldn't be long until the Irvings would have their own. It seems the activity started in September of 1931, around the time that Vori had turned 13. And as so often the case, it started with a simple noise, a tapping, late at night. James and Margaret were sat there when they heard it coming from above, a sort of repeated tap between the wooden ceiling and their roof. James, convinced it was mice, went up to investigate. He looked around but he couldn't find anything. But he did notice something strange. There was a little Indian woodcutting that he owned, laying on the floor in the middle of the attic. It was odd. James had no memory of putting it up there. Curious, he picked up the object and dropped it to the floor again. It created the same sound that he and Margaret had been hearing from below. A couple of nights later, they heard it again. The tapping. But this time it was followed by the sound of something running. Convinced again it must be some sort of animal, James said out loud, "That is no mouse." This was much larger. This claim seemed to cause whatever was running around above them to respond. It barked like a dog, then hissed like a cat. It then growled, before repeating the various sounds over and over. Then there was a sudden loud cracking noise, and simultaneously a picture frame on the other side of the room shook from side to side. Then, silence. Understandably, the Irvings were baffled, but once again, when they went to inspect, there was nothing there. At some point in October, James and Vori apparently caught sight of something running around. It looked about 9 inches long with yellowish fur. James was convinced it looked like a stoat or a weasel. Over the following days, the sounds continued, before they seemed to warp from the sounds of animals to almost the babbling of a baby, and then back to the sounds of an animal. Curious, James decided to try and interact with the sound. Bear in mind, the family had been living a secluded, lonely life on the farm for quite some time at this point. There wasn't a whole lot of entertainment to be had. When the creature barked, James said out loud, "Dog." And the sound on the other side of the wall repeated the word back to him. When it hissed, he said cat. Again, the voice repeated what James had said. This continued for weeks, but very quickly the voice became very articulate. It acted as though it were learning to talk from James, but Irving admits there is no way this could be possible in such a short space of time. It was almost like the voice was toying with him, pretending it was learning from him, and James was happy to play along. James later noted in his diaries that he believes it pretended to learn as a way of easing the family in. If it had just started talking, James admits that most people would just instantly leave the house, but this gradual phasing of sounds to voice made them feel strangely more comfortable around it. The voice was unusual, high-pitched. Most witnesses described it as higher than a human voice. The voice began to talk to the family more and more, and claimed that they should call it Jack. Curiously, the Irving family still seemed convinced that this was some sort of animal, and the voice apparently confirmed their suspicion, telling them he was in fact a weasel. But quickly, the family's amusement at this strange occurrence turned to fear. The creature, whatever it was, could be heard running around behind the wooden panelling that ran throughout the house, its voice often being heard from the small holes that could be found around the property. It would bang loudly on the walls and laugh, a maniacal laugh that the family would often describe as satanic. keeping them awake late into the night. But the reason for their belief that it was a physical creature was that it appeared to be very physical. They could hear it running. At times it would spit through the holes at the family. They would find small puddles of urine on the floor. In his diary, James wrote that he believed this thing was trying to drive them away. It did not seem to like the family, and he mentions various objectionable acts that he does not want to put into writing. Some of these may have been discussed later though, when James told investigators of the creatures at times sexualized taunting of Margaret. In one such case, as she was getting ready for bed, the voice would describe each item of clothing she was removing, until Margaret quickly became terrified and covered herself up. The couple lay in bed one night and James whispered to his wife, "What in the name of God can this thing be?" Loudly, the voice repeated James's words in a mocking tone. If James sat up in bed at any point, the voice would yell at him to lay back down, calling him a devil as it did. If he went to the toilet in the middle of the night, the voice would loudly describe what James was doing, so that it could be heard throughout the house. This was another curious detail. The voice sounded like it would come from a specific area, but somehow it also reverberated around the house, so everyone could hear it to some degree. It would sing small parts of hymns and songs. It would even throw objects, most often rocks, at the family. James became concerned that the creature may move on to kitchen knives. But despite the Irvings' curious belief that this was in fact some sort of animal still, the voice started to disagree, telling them in its own words that it was a ghost in the form of a weasel, and it intended to haunt them. This apparently particularly scared the young girl Vori. James and Margaret had made a point to try and not show fear to whatever this creature was, but it clearly spotted a weakness in the Irvings' daughter, and it began more and more often to focus its attention on her. Early on, James had been to see his neighbour Ian Corlett and had asked the man to borrow a rat trap, claiming he had some sort of weasel in the walls of his house. A week later, Ian saw James again and asked him if he had managed to catch it. James told the man no. The blinking thing had started talking. Ian stood there, not quite sure he understood Irving's weird joke. 2 months after the strange activity had begun, Margaret was away and James and his daughter had both gone to bed, when they were awoken by a loud scream. Vori asked her father what was going on. James thought he had finally gotten the creature. He had left a piece of bread with rat poison on it near the top of the stairs, and it appeared Jack had found it. For 20 minutes the screaming continued, Vori covering her ears, disturbed by the pained screams of the poor creature. Then suddenly it stopped. Vori climbed a ladder and looked into the loft space, where the screams had apparently been coming from, but nothing was there. The voice went quiet for a few days, before making a sudden return. Again, another night the family was awoken by its screams and gargles of pain, this time non-stop for a full half hour, but seemingly the creature wasn't sick, nor dying. It was just teasing James for his misguided attempt at leaving out the poison, telling the family later that he did it for the devilment. James attempted to block up the many holes in the home, believing that the creature was using them to move around the house quickly, but it did nothing to stop it. The voice started to become increasingly aggressive towards Vori, threatening her, throwing stones. James and Margaret decided to move her into their bedroom at night. While dismantling the girl's bed, Jack stomped around in the walls, screaming and shouting, smashing against them with a violent force. Once the bed was moved, the voice shouted, apparently trembling with rage, that it would follow her wherever they moved her. That night, terrified, James barricaded the door with chairs and a dresser. At some point, something began banging on the door with such a force that it caused the door to bulge. And then the voice was heard, screaming that it was coming in. The banging went silent for a moment, before a large pot in the room flew from one side, crashing into the floor. The Irvings desperately searched, but again, no sign of the creature could be found. These first 6 months were apparently hell for the family. The voice was angry and antagonistic, mocking and attempting to scare the family away with every chance it got. Rumours of the creature had begun to spread. People would come up to the farm to try and get a look at what was going on. It became such an issue that James had to put up barricades to stop trespassers, and later signs informing people that they could enter the farm by appointment only. But James and Margaret would often visit the much larger nearby town of Peel to visit family and for work. As they told their story to their friends and family, the word quickly got out. There wasn't much going on in the area in those days, so fantastical tales about a talking weasel obviously sparked the imagination. In January of 1932, even the media had started paying attention to the story. Over in England, a journalist was sent to the island from the Daily Dispatch to investigate. The journalist arrived at the farm and was met by James Irving. The reporter told James that he had come to find out if the rumours were true, that the house was haunted. James told the reporter it wasn't. There were no spooks in his home, but he is worried about the amount of people that were suddenly trying to visit the farm. Despite this, James invited the man in and told him the whole story. He told the man he had gotten the creature to say phrases in English, German, Yiddish, Spanish, Flemish, and Hebrew. Apparently the little creature was as interested in languages as James himself was. He also claimed that the voice could hold a conversation and could tell the family about events that were happening in the nearby village. James stated that the creature had never taken any food, despite having the opportunities to do so. He also gave the reporter the name of several locals who had visited the farm and heard the voice. James told the reporter that they had considered leaving, but that the stories about the place were having a negative impact on the property, claiming it seemed it would be difficult to sell, with the locals all making claims that the place was haunted. The journalist went to leave, but as he did, James called him back, saying the voice had started talking. They crept up to the open door, and there he heard it. This strange, high-pitched voice that he would later claim he didn't believe could come from a human throat. The voice was talking to Margaret in another room. She, believing the reporter had left, was telling it that the man had gone. The voice was seemingly suspicious of outsiders visiting the home, but the voice disagreed with her, saying that the reporter hadn't left, and that it could hear him whispering, which he was currently doing to James. Then it said, "I won't talk for these people. They are all liars," before falling silent. This reporter appears to be the origin point for one of the more widely reported possible explanations for the voice's existence, and that is that Vory was a skilled ventriloquist. However, while he felt this was possible, he didn't see any evidence that the girl had this talent and was somehow responsible for the voice. This is a claim that seems to divide quite a few people involved in the case, but we'll get into that a little later. The reporter left though with a profound belief that at the very least, James Irving seemed to genuinely believe the voice was real, and that he was convinced it was some sort of miraculous animal, not a paranormal entity. Early in 1932, James and Vory potentially got another look at the creature when they looked out their window to see in the garden what appeared to be a very large cat, striped like a tiger. Its head even larger, almost resembling a bulldog. It had no tail, much like the Manx cats that lived on the island, but it was far too large to be one. When they went outside, they could find no trace of the animal. They noticed this strange sighting, but the description didn't seem to match whatever was inside their home. But when Margaret returned that night, James was telling her about what they had seen, when the voice interrupted him, saying, "It was me you saw, Jim." Jim being what the creature would call James. This became a common thing with sightings of the creature. People would often report him as looking different to what others had seen, leading some to suggest that he was somehow capable of changing his appearance. Not long after this, James had looked out his window to see two boys on his property hunting rabbits. He went outside to talk to the boys, inquiring about their names. It soon became apparent that he actually knew one of them. He was the son of a man named Jeff Lowry, who had once worked on the farm. Again, the evening arrived and James was talking to Margaret in the kitchen, Conversations in the home were no longer ever private. Jack was always around to hear. Shortly after, the voice shouted out, "I don't like the name Jack. Call me Jeff." Apparently, the voice was only able to spell out words phonetically, and this is where the strange spelling of G-E-F for Jeff came from. Furthermore, not long after this, Jeff decided that he was not a ghost, telling the Irvins that he was in fact just an extra special mongoose who could talk. One issue with this being that the descriptions of those who claimed to see Jeff rarely matched up with the description of a mongoose. But this information was enough for James, who for some strange reason still believed he was dealing with an animal that had apparently learnt to talk. Jeff claimed that he was born in India 80 years prior and had ended up coming to England after briefly being in Egypt. It seemed though that Jeff wasn't a recent arrival, not having all the information to connect the earlier tales of strange activity around the farm at this point. They hadn't even considered it. But Jeff would make references to friends of the family who they hadn't seen in years, as well as the Irving's 2 older children who had moved away some time ago at this point. Jeff apparently revealing that he did not like the older Irving girl in particular. Vori's bed stayed in her parents' bedroom for several months after the initial move, but this seemed to be around the time that Jeff stopped harassing the family, or at least he did it less often. Jeff claimed that initially he thought the family didn't like him, that they would try to make him leave. An understandable reaction considering James had attempted to poison him, but he now seemingly wanted to live in some sort of harmony with the family. He continued to be increasingly attached to Vori in particular, following her everywhere she went, even when she would leave the farm. Vori attended the nearby school in Derby Village. James had gone to meet her one day and ended up chatting to her teacher, Miss Greer, about Jeff. As I said, rumours of the strange creature had begun to circulate in the community, and James was all too happy to talk to anyone about it, apparently much to the dismay of his wife and daughter, who, while fascinated by Jeff themselves, were more keen to keep the whole thing quiet until they understood exactly what they were dealing with. Despite having been alone with no one else in earshot when talking to his daughter's teacher, on the walk back home, James and Vori heard Jeff's voice. He demanded to know why James had been talking about him and what he had told the teacher. This became something of a common occurrence in the months and years that followed. Jeff was happy to eavesdrop on others' conversations both at the farm and in the wider community, but he did not like it if others took an interest in him without his consent. He seemed to want to remain the family's secret, although Jeff's moods and opinions on most subjects seemed to change on a whim regularly. If Jeff was sneaky and hard to spot, or actually invisible, seemed to be a difficult question to answer. There was a relatively early report though of a worker on the farm claiming he saw a sandwich floating through the air low to the ground and disappearing into the bushes, as though it were being carried by an invisible squirrel. Early on, Jeff apparently claimed to have no stomach, that he relied purely on air to survive. But when in early 1932 the family started leaving food out for him, he eagerly gobbled it up. Lean bacon, bananas and chocolate were all apparently favourites of Jeff. Margaret claimed that she was even able to feed Jeff by hand once, when she saw a small fluffy shape running along the beams of the home one night. She held up some food and he took it. She didn't get a good look at him from the position she was in before he scurried away, but she felt his teeth on her finger. He would still regularly create loud bangs that would shake the entire house. The Irvins explained a strange detail about the creature that suggested how he may be able to do this. While he looked very much like a weasel or similar animal, they claimed he had hands, each with 3 fingers, that disturbingly resembled human hands, but much smaller. This allowed him to grip objects, throw them, and even bang his fists when annoyed. He had shown these before by poking them through a hole in the wall of Vori's bedroom. Jeff would laugh, at times a creepy and disturbing laugh, others more playful and fun. He loved to sing, and not just in English but also Spanish, the local dialect Manx, and apparently in Hindi, although some have pointed out that many of the phrases that Jeff uses in Hindi are incorrect or don't really translate well, which seems odd considering his claims of being from India, although it's worth noting this is just one of many Indian languages. When he would leave the house and return, strangely the only animals that seemed to react to his presence were the geese, who would make sounds when Jeff was returning to the farm. The family's sheepdog apparently had no interest in the mongoose. Jeff even had his own space in the Irvings' home that was referred to as his sanctum. To the right of the stairs on the upper floor was a ledge. The stairs were boxed in by a wooden partition where the ledge was. Technically this led into Vori's room, but seemingly was also accessible through the parents' room, allowing Jeff to move between the two. They would often leave his food there. They also believed this is where Jeff liked to sleep, although they would never catch him in the act. There was also a wooden chair here that they would often hear Jeff pushing around, claiming that he used it for exercise. Jeff enjoyed playing with toys, and visitors to the home would bring him gifts like bouncy balls and chocolate to try and win favour with the strange creature. Two local boys, Will Cubban and Harry Hall, came to visit, eager to meet Jeff. The boys in fact did see a creature running around their garden that matched Jeff's description, but not at the farm. James took them into Vori's room and showed them a fastening on the outside, telling them that on occasion Jeff would lock the girl in her room, and that it couldn't be done from the inside of the room. As a demonstration, Vori went inside and the boys went into the kitchen, asking Jeff to do it. Sure enough, he did. They also heard Jeff singing and claimed that the creature had quite a foul mouth at times. He even apparently spat at the boys at one point, but he didn't appear hostile, telling them that he just wanted to make them laugh. They then played the penny game, a regular exercise that James would get many visitors to do. They would flip a coin on the porch and the voice of Jeff would tell them which way the coin had landed. The voice got it right every time, even when they tried to trick it by not actually flipping the coin. It called them out on their deceit. None of the Irvings were close enough to be able to see the coin from where the boys were, but this strange trick left an uneasy question in the air. Was Jeff's eyesight so good that he could see the coin from one of the holes in the wooden panelling, or was he able to read minds? Jeff's ability to know what was going on in other places was well recorded at this point. Margaret would be inside the house and Jeff's voice would inform her exactly what animals her husband was working on at that moment, what he was doing, when he was coming back. He brought the family gossip from the local area, telling them things that he should have no way of knowing, describing the insides of homes the family had never visited, but they would later find would match. Although it seemed this wasn't always through some ability to see things that were happening in other places, but instead literally visiting others and eavesdropping on conversations. At times, Jeff would fall ill, with the Irvings finding pools of vomit under their bed. He would catch colds, filling the walls with a rattling cough, one time even yelling out, "Jim, I have a goddamn cough. I have a hell of a cough. You will need to give me something." Using the word hell and devil often was something Jeff was fond of saying, as well as screeching "vanished" when he would go away, and one of his favourite phrases to say was "nuts," as well as a slew of different insults that he loved to throw around. Vori was quite the skilled rabbit hunter apparently, and would often take her dog Mona out, using her as a pointer to distract the rabbit, so she could come up behind it and club it with a stick. Jeff apparently took it upon himself to help. He began bringing the Irvings dead rabbits. It would be easy to say that these were actually being killed by Vori, but Jeff's method of killing was different. The animals would be found with their eyes bulging, but not a scratch on them, suggesting that Jeff was strangling the creatures. Jeff would bring so many into the home that the family actually managed to turn it into a secondary source of income, selling the rabbits that Jeff would kill, However, Jeff soon realised the value he was bringing in, and if he was in a bad mood or didn't get his way, he would threaten to go on strike. Jeff continued to be fiercely protective of Ori in these early days. Her family's reputation was not doing her popularity any good. The phrase spook began to refer not just to the phenomena taking place in their home, but was also used as a nickname for the at times strange and shy girl. When she was headed to the bus stop one day, a group of other children saw her coming and began to mock her. Vori wasn't close enough to hear them, but apparently Jeff was. They began to be pelted by rocks by an invisible force. Rumours continued that Vori was somehow responsible for faking Jeff, a fact that Jeff himself was not happy with. He once overheard a neighbouring farmer talking about how the girl was responsible for the spook. Jeff informed the Irvings later of what he had heard, and started yelling that he would kill the farmer's turkeys. Apparently shortly after this, sure enough, all of the farmer's ducks and turkeys vanished. No trace of them was ever found. This was a good example of the two sides of Jeff's personality. He could be a fun and playful entity, telling jokes, playing games, singing songs, and even at times could be heard dancing in his sanctum. But at other times it appeared the mask slipped, and a much angrier presence made itself known, much as it had done in those first 6 months. He would say things to the family like, "I could kill you all if I liked, but I won't." He regularly liked to threaten livestock, saying that if the Irvings were kind to him, he would bring them good luck. If not, he would kill all their poultry. He also would ask if the family had any enemies on the other farms. If they did, he said he would kill their lambs for them. One moment, Jeff would berate the family with insults. The next, he would declare that he was shy and timid. It was almost like Jeff was made up of more than one personality. The local bus drivers at the nearby station were a particular target of Jeff's nosy ways. Jeff would often reveal discussions they had, and even apparently told one driver about the exact jumper his wife was knitting back at their home. They became so enraged by Jeff that they began setting traps for him, but with no luck. Other visitors to the home claimed that Jeff knew things about them that he should have no way of knowing. What they were reading, the rooms they were staying in, personal details that the Irving family should have no knowledge of. In February of 1932, Harry Price had received a letter from the Irving's neighbour, who told him all about Jeff. Price's health wasn't the best at this point, and he was busy with another case, so he sent a man named Captain Harold Dennis to the island. Dennis was a former ambulance driver for the Red Cross during the war. He also had a keen interest in zoology, and actually owned a number of exotic animals. Side note here, he actually offered to bring a mongoose to the island to meet Jeff. Jeff apparently did not like this idea, and said he would kill it. Price described Captain Dennis as a well-known racing motorist and businessman who was very shrewd and not easily hoodwinked. Dennis would make 3 trips to the island to meet the Irvings and Jeff, with mixed results. He arrived early one evening and was welcomed in by the family. They set about telling him the whole story and began showing him the cracks in the walls that they believed Jeff travelled through. After several hours, Jeff had failed to show up, and Dennis had decided to leave for the night. As soon as he stepped out of the door, as was often the case with visitors, Jeff made himself known. Dennis heard a shrill voice saying, "Go away, who is that man?" James Irving announced that it was Jeff talking. The voice continued, but Dennis said he struggled to understand it. This was actually a common complaint of many who heard Jeff. They would catch odd words or sentences, but at times it just seemed to devolve into a high-pitched squeaking. But James, who was much more used to hearing Jeff's voice, was able to translate his words a lot easier. As soon as Dennis re-entered the home, the voice stopped again. When Dennis returned the following morning, he was met by James, who said that Jeff had been very talkative that morning. He had apparently agreed to talk with the man, as long as he could provide a gift to Vori. Apparently, he requested either a camera or a gramophone. Jeff had also said that he'd been watching Dennis the night before and didn't like him. Jeff's reason for this was that Dennis did not believe in him. Jeff was always reluctant to provide any evidence of his existence, but if he felt that someone didn't believe in him, he became irritated. Another of the many contradictions of Jeff the Talking Mongoose. Dennis had been unconvinced by the voice initially, but he was a little more perplexed when later that afternoon he had been sat with the Irvings at the kitchen table, having a cup of tea, when a needle appeared to fly out from behind him. The only thing that had been behind Dennis was a wall, but there was a small hole in it that it appears the needle could have come from. It seemed Jeff had decided to throw something out at him. In the hours that followed, he heard scurrying and strange sounds that he could find no trace for. Then, by another hole, he found a puddle of liquid that James claimed was likely Jeff's pee. Later that evening, Vori and her mother went upstairs to see if they could get Jeff to talk. Sure enough, the voice was heard downstairs by Dennis. The voice yet again informed him that it did not like him, and if he tried to creep towards the stairs, no matter how quiet he was, Jeff would screech that the man was coming. Again, with two of the family out of eyesight, Dennis didn't find this too convincing. Dennis reported back to Price that he felt that James Irving was a trustworthy witness, but he was more suspicious of the two women in the house. Many have pointed out similarities to the Jeff case and that of a traditional poltergeist case, particularly due to the presence of a teenage girl at the centre of it all. But unlike most poltergeist incidents that seem to be short-lived but very intense affairs, Jeff stuck around for years. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1935 that Captain Dennis would return. James had come down to meet Dennis at the Waterfall Inn in the nearby village, where they had lunch and walked along the beach. During their conversation, Dennis made a curious comment, saying he felt like Jeff was with them. James explained that this wasn't unlikely. Jeff had been known to follow James 4 miles some days when he would visit the town of Peel. Captain Dennis picked a flower that he put in the buttonhole of his jacket, and they began the walk towards the farm. As soon as they entered, Margaret told them that Jeff had been with them. He knew that they had beer with lunch. He had revealed details about their conversation on the beach, and even apparently saw Dennis pick the flower. This was infinitely more interesting to Dennis than anything he had experienced on his first visit. There was no way James could have gotten this information back to his wife before their arrival. He considered the idea that maybe someone had been watching them, but he couldn't think of any space on the beach someone could have hid and still been close enough to hear. The more out there theory that didn't involve Jeff was the idea that Margaret could have some kind of psychic ability, a theory that was suggested by a few over the years. Jeff was quiet at first, but when Vori left the house to go out into the farmyard, he spoke. Dennis, still suspicious the girl could be responsible, rushed to the window, but he could see her outside, far away. That night, as he walked down the path, he heard Jeff again. No one other than James was close to him, and Irving was in full view. Dennis wasn't sure what was going on here, but he was definitely more intrigued than he had been on his visit 3 years before. This was enough to coax Harry Price to head to the farm himself. Just a couple of months after Dennis's visit, he arranged a trip with his associate Richard Lambert, a man of higher social stature than Price, and a fellow member of what would become known as the British Film Institute. His insistence on bringing Lambert, as well as his involvement of others in this case, seemed to suggest that Price was taking this somewhat seriously, although he was headed to Dawlish Cashen, firmly with a sceptical view of the whole thing, something that was likely increased by the fur sample he had received. Price had requested the family send him a sample of Jeff's fur. Apparently the family had left Jeff a pair of scissors in his sanctum and asked him to trim some. Jeff told them to go and look, and sure enough, there, sat on the side, was a clump of fur. But when they sent this to Price, Price was frustrated to discover that it appeared to be dog fur. While it seemed unlikely they believed this would not be discovered when testing, their version of how they received the fur does leave open the window that Jeff, in his traditionally mischievous ways, had simply snipped the fur from the family's dog Mona. Jeff was apparently also not thrilled about the idea of Price visiting. He explained he had come to like Captain Dennis, but he was wary of Harry Price, saying he didn't like him, and that he would put his story in the papers, something that Jeff had expressed time and time again about others involved in the media. He didn't trust them and didn't want them to share his story. In fact, prior to their arrival, Jeff apparently went missing for several days. Lambert and Price arrived on the 30th of July 1935. Irving had seemingly rented a car to pick up the men, apparently wanting to make a good impression on them. When they arrived at the farm, they provided the family with a camera, asking them to use it to try and get photos of Jeff in the future. Price would later receive these after a lot of back and forth, and he wasn't particularly impressed by their attempts to photograph Jeff. The two men initially began talking to Vori and Margaret about the whole escapade. Margaret pretty much backed up everything they already knew, but Vori, now 17, was much quieter. Many have noted that James Irving generally took over any conversation, especially when it came to Jeff. He was a friendly but at times overbearing presence, which could be frustrating when investigators were trying to get the full story. Their first night was a frustrating one. Jeff, who had been silent for a while at this point, remained so during their visit. Price and Lambert made note that the Irvings seemed embarrassed that the men had travelled so far, but that Jeff was not interested in entertaining them. They kept attempting to coax him to speak, but with no luck. The two men left around midnight. While they had seen nothing to convince them, they were slightly more convinced by the Irvings, having met them in person. It seemed unbelievable to them that they would keep this story up for so many years at this point, if there wasn't at least some foundation of truth to it. Price seemed very interested in the theory that Vori was the centre of this whole thing. The next day he asked to take her out for the day, so they could speak to her away from her family. Vori agreed, but James did not, insisting he come along. Yet again, James dominated the conversation, making for another frustrating day for the investigators. They left the island with nothing to show for their visit. At a later date, Price again requested by letter that Vori could come to London to be interviewed and have some tests run at his laboratory. But James was apparently incensed by this, and did not like the idea of his teenage daughter being alone with either of these men, refusing to let her even speak to them without him. He said he could come to London in her place, but that she would not leave the island. They noted the strange upbringing the girl had, having never left the island, and spending the majority of her time alone with her much older parents. She had become a quiet and very reserved girl, and the pair could see how lonely she seemed to be. Price and Lambert's trip to Dawlish Cushen had been a wasted one. The only interesting detail Price was able to gather from being there himself was his assertion that the wooden panelling that lined the inside of the house seemed to create a kind of acoustic boost to sounds, allowing a voice to be heard in other parts of the house with ease, seemingly suggesting that it would be possible for someone to speak into a hole elsewhere in the house, and for it to be heard, clear as day, in another room. However, a lack of any real evidence or testing is available for this theory. Shortly after, Price sent another associate of his to Dawlish Cushen. She pretended not to know Price, but still Jeff wouldn't make a sound when she was present. Apparently after leaving, Jeff did finally talk. Margaret, who in particular would get angry at Jeff when he refused to speak, asked why he hadn't spoken for their guest, to which he replied that he thought she might be a newspaper woman. In October of that year, Captain Dennis would return for one final visit. When he arrived, he was told Jeff had gone to the Waterfall Inn to see Dennis arrive in town, but had not returned. At around 9:30 PM, all the geese on the farm started clucking, announcing that Jeff was back. Still, Jeff didn't speak though. Vori went to bed at around 11 PM and shortly after they began to hear tapping on the walls. Of course, Dennis was suspicious this could be Vori. They pushed Jeff to talk but were met with more, at times quite violent, banging. He then heard what sounded like a loud bang on one of the bedroom doors upstairs, followed by Jeff finally speaking, telling Dennis to go and look. He went upstairs to find the fastening on the door had locked Vori in. There was no way to lock it from the inside. Something Jeff often liked to do to the girl for some reason. They unlocked the door to find her laying in bed. While in the room, they could hear something scurrying around above their heads. And then for the next 15 minutes, Jeff wouldn't shut up. Banging sounds were heard from all different places in the house. High-pitched screams ringed through the walls. And at one point, even a metal chain was thrown to the floor in Vori's bedroom. Jeff then became more chatty, directly interacting with Dennis and the Irvings. When Dennis asked him to hear one of his trademark sinister laughs, the voice obliged. It chilled Dennis to the bone to hear it. When Dennis asked him to come closer, he heard a voice say, "Hello everybody," another of his common phrases. The voice sounded like it had come from inside the kitchen this time. On occasion, Dennis would randomly run out into the hall or to the stairs with his lantern to try and catch Jeff or whoever was making the sounds in the act. But each time no one would be there, and Jeff would get annoyed, calling Dennis a damned sleech for trying to see him. Jeff would often berate people who tried to look at him without permission, including the family. At one point, Dennis was sure he heard the voice coming from the wooden panelling behind where Margaret was sitting, adding to the common theory that the voices were coming from inside the walls. The conversations continued until 3 in the morning, when Jeff ended it with a slightly sinister threat that he would throw a brick at Dennis when he slept. Jeff didn't, but at 7 AM, Captain Dennis was awoken by Jeff's voice, shouting, "Get up, Dennis." Dennis returned to England but kept up correspondence with the Irvings for years to follow. He was now a firm believer in Jeff, but still had no understanding of what Jeff was. Price continued to correspond with James though, and eventually Price and Lambert published a book on the case called The Haunting of Cashin's Gap. Price had been suspicious of the Irvings' possible interest in using the Jeff story for monetary gain. Seemingly they had been hesitant to do so early on, but as the years had progressed, the family had fallen on harder and harder times. James was keen to share in any profits the book would make, while Price agreed if the book made enough to pay back the publishers. He would then split the profits 3 ways. But he said this was unlikely. He said most of his published works didn't really make any money, and that this was purely being published as an academic work. Sure enough, it didn't. What it did lead to, though, was a court case involving Jeff the Talking Mongoose. Widely reported in the press at the time, the mongoose case was presented to the High Court of Justice in November of 1936. Lambert had been the target of much mockery from his colleagues, particularly those on the board of the British Film Institute, who claimed that Lambert was not fit to hold a place on the board anymore due to his interest in occult matters and apparent belief in a talking mongoose. Various days in court were spent debating Jeff, including one long-winded section where the judge debated what the plural of mongoose was. Apparent photos that the Irvings had taken of Jeff, which were not particularly convincing, were held up in court as part of the case, with much debated over which shape was supposed to be the fabled mongoose. The entire thing made Jeff even more famous, and was seen as a hilariously bizarre piece of British legal history. Lambert actually ended up receiving £7,500 in libel damages, seemingly making him the only person to actually make any money out of the tale of Jeff. As the years progressed, Jeff was heard from less and less. Vori in particular seemed to distance herself from him, and the once inseparable pair's relationship was ruined. Vori even going as far to say she hated Jeff, and that she wished he had never come into their lives. He had made her seem like a freak in the eyes of many, but she still would never deny his existence. Jeff's relationship with Margaret and James, though, was still strong. He began to see Margaret as a mother figure, apparently, and as he drifted away from Vori, he became more and more attached to James. But this didn't stop his appearance from becoming less and less common. Various spiritualists would visit over the years. Some claimed to interact with Jeff, many others did not. Jeff was becoming more selective over who he would speak to. There would be one final notable visitor to Dorish Crescendo. While Harry Price is the name most associated with the case, it was actually the Hungarian psychoanalyst, lawyer, journalist, and paranormal investigator, Nandor Fodor, who spent the longest time at the farm. Apparently the 1930s were a time that you could have a wide variety of professions for one man. Fodor had apparently been following the story closely since it first appeared in the press in 1931, but it wouldn't be until 1937 that he would travel to the island in search of Jeff, after publishing an article on the idea of animal spirits the year prior. Upon meeting the family, Fodor believed that Margaret Irving could be the type to be a so-called psychic. Margaret herself apparently believed she had some sort of ability, and interestingly, this is a thought that many who met her had throughout the years. Even Jeff himself would apparently at times refer to her as Maggie the Witch. However, during Fodor's entire week-long stay, he never actually had a direct encounter with Jeff. The closest he came was apparently one night while using the outside toilet. He heard something thrown at the roof. He asked out loud if this was Jeff making the noise, but wasn't greeted with the strange creature's voice. Despite this, Fodor was able to interview the family at length, as well as a huge number of locals who claimed to have witnessed some of the activity at the farm, including a postman who had heard Jeff's foul-mouthed rants, the boys Harry and Will, who believed they had seen and heard Jeff, a bus mechanic who Jeff had apparently been spying on in his home, and a bus conductor who was regularly having his sandwiches stolen by Jeff. Interestingly, Fodor's initial takeaway was similar to James's first thoughts. He said, "Jeff is not a poltergeist, he is not an earthbound spirit, and he is not a ghost." Despite Jeff's apparent abilities to change his appearance, feats of strength, ability to talk, and even the power of invisibility, Fodor was more drawn to the examples where Jeff would spit, urinate, cough, and eat, saying that the mystery was not a psychic one, but that Jeff was simply an extra clever little mongoose. However, Fodor's theory on this would change years later. In a rather strange quote, he said, "I was not yet equipped with adequate psychoanalytical knowledge to conduct an exploration of James Irving's unconscious. His dream life, I am confident, would have given sorely needed clues to understand the intellectual development of Jeff, and to find the storehouse of his power." It seemed Fodor went on to believe that Jeff was some kind of psychological projection from James Irving, a man bored and lonely, living in abject poverty, starved of mental stimulation, with only a handful of books as his only entertainment. That James Irving had in fact made up Jeff, unknowingly, but in doing so had created something very real nonetheless. One note that seems to connect to this is that in later years Jeff was apparently heard begging James to let him go, suggesting the man was somehow responsible for his presence. In 1940, Vori finally left the farm. Now an adult and employed, she would return once a week to see her parents, but was now living her own life, away from Jeff and their remote world. In 1942, a newspaper report popped up, saying the Derby spook was once again active, although there appears to be little information on what exactly this incident was. Around 1944, James Irving fell very ill. By this point, Jeff had not been seen or heard from in quite some time, it seemed. The family's eldest daughter, Elsie, who had been living in Liverpool, returned to the farm to be with her father in his final days. Elsie had never believed in the crazy stories about Jeff, a fact that, according to the family, made Jeff take quite a disliking to her. But she admitted, in the 6 months that she stayed in the farm caring for her father, she would hear strange noises, sounds that seemed to get louder whenever Vori would stay. James died at 4:10 a.m. on the 6th of August 1945 at the age of 72. The moment he passed, Margaret and Elsie had been sitting by the fireplace. Neither one of them could believe it when they saw a brush that was placed on top of the fireplace start to move back and forth on its own accord, as though someone were brushing the mantle. As James breathed his final breath, the brush stopped. Margaret believed this was Jeff, making one last visit to say goodbye to his old friend. After his death, Margaret had no interest in staying in Dawlish Cushen any longer. It appears James had been right about his assertion that the whole Jeff story was actually having a negative impact on their finances due to the value of the property. The farm sold at auction for just £140, less than half of what the Irvings had paid for it. The auctioneer joking that the Derby spook would be thrown in for free. And Mr. Robert Cubban purchased the farm, a local retired farmer, who announced that he did not believe in Jeff at all. Strangely, he sold the property again just a few months later, never revealing why he had decided against owning Dawlish Cushen. The farm was then purchased by a man named Leslie Graham, who set out to improve the farm, spending a considerable amount doing so. In 1947, Jeff was again in the news. A picture of Leslie Graham holding what appeared to be a dead polecat adorned the front page. Apparently he had seen the creature on his property late one night. He had attempted to capture it, but when the animal attacked him, he had killed it. The media claimed that the man had in fact killed Jeff the talking mongoose, although he didn't match the more commonly used descriptions of Jeff, and the remaining Irvins did not believe that it was him. Graham claimed that at times he would see Margaret and Vori in the local area, up until the time that Margaret passed away. He said neither one of them would ever talk about Jeff anymore. It seemed they wanted to put the whole thing behind them. In 1971, the farmhouse was demolished. Although some buildings of the farm remained, the actual house was destroyed, but no one seems to know why. Dawlish Cushen is now increasingly hard to find on the island, but that still doesn't stop people trying to track the place down, in the hopes of getting to see Jeff for themselves. Every few years, the story of Jeff gains some level of notoriety again, and for understandable reasons. It's such a strange little tale, and inevitably when it does, people would reach out to Vori to talk about her experiences as a child at Dawlish Cushen. But time and time again she would refuse. Even when decent sums of money were offered, she would turn it down. She had spent a good chunk of her adolescent life being called the spook by others on the island, treated as a strange person to be avoided. Moving away was her chance to start afresh, to put the whole Jeff thing behind her. In 1996, filmmaker Brian Catling reached out to Vori after finding out she was now living in Cheltenham. She again refused, saying she had left all that behind her. She was now 78 and didn't love the idea that the people who were in her life now would hear all about her strange experience. The only time that Vori seemed to talk about the case was in a single interview in 1970. The interviewer asked her what's happened to Jeff, and she stated that he seemed to disappear in the late 1930s, going missing for longer and longer periods until he just didn't show up anymore. It stated that Vori now hated Jeff, that while he had been a great friend to her early on, she was a shy girl and the constant attention brought people to her home. She didn't want that. She didn't want to be constantly bombarded with questions from strangers. On the rumours that she was a ventriloquist and that she was somehow responsible for the voice, Vori simply pointed out that if she was that talented a ventriloquist, then she would have surely made a successful career out of that, rather than the modest life that she was now living. The only money the Irvings ever made from the story was £5 boarding from Nandor Fodor and an occasional guinea for pictures to the newspaper. She said Jeff was detrimental to her life. She was bullied. She even believed Jeff kept her from getting married because she couldn't imagine explaining this part of her life to a possible husband. She said she didn't know if he was actually a mongoose, but he was a small animal, about 9 inches long, and would talk to them from the wainscoting in their home, with a high-pitched voice and often expletive-filled sentences. She didn't think it merely imitated their voices, as it carried on full-blown conversations with the family. The reporter asked her, flat out, if the story was a hoax. Her reply was, "It was not a hoax, and I wish it had never happened. If my mother and I had our way, we would never have told anybody about it. But father was sort of wrapped up in it. It was such a wonderful phenomenon that he just had to tell people about it." The reporter ended his time with Vori that day, pointing out that many newspapers would pay her a large sum to confess the true story of what happened in that farm. But she refused this idea, despite being in a somewhat poor financial situation herself. The reporter stated that despite how crazy the story was, he believed her. It seemed to be very much the case that Vori, 30 years later, still believed in Jeff, the talking mongoose. So what really happened? This is normally the part of an episode where I talk about the various theories surrounding a case, some that lean towards paranormal explanations, others that may point to a hoax or natural occurrences. But where do you start with this one? To begin with, there is virtually no recorded evidence of the existence of Jeff, whatever he was. All that exists are a series of very unconvincing photographs, some of which don't appear to show anything at all. Others are what almost appears to be an out-of-focus hat. The reason we know so much about this case is due to the work of the various investigators that visited, who interviewed the family and other witnesses, as well as the letters and diaries of James Irving, which give a very in-depth insight to the activities of Jeff. This is commonly referred to as a hoax these days, and that evaluation is completely understandable when you look at the story. But it's worth pointing out there is no concrete evidence for this either. Some more recent articles I read state that Vori was caught faking Jeff's noises, but I'm not sure where this information has come from. It wasn't present in anything I directly read. There are certainly many times where she could be responsible, but I don't believe she was ever caught red-handed. Many who have a passing knowledge of this case seem to point to the fact that Vori was a skilled ventriloquist. Again, I'm not really sure where this theory came from initially, but it seems to be presented as a fact in more recent coverage of this case. The claims of Vori being a natural ventriloquist seem to stem from the original newspaper report in early 1932, although the writer there seems to imply this is just a theory, not something he has evidence for. Some investigators who spoke to students at Vori's school also back up this claim that she was able to throw her voice, but others refute this, saying they never heard or saw her doing anything like this. Of course, Vori also refutes this in later years. While it's certainly a possible explanation, it doesn't seem to have been possible for every instance of Jeff talking, unless those accounts were false, and it seems to be a theory that has snowballed into being presented as fact. Another suggested idea is that James was actually the victim of the hoax. Numerous investigators stated that they believed that James was a true believer in Jeff, but were more suspicious of the two girls. A rumour that has existed since early on in the case is that Margaret and Vori hated living on the farm and resented James for moving them there. They then came up with a haunted house hoax to try and scare him back, but it didn't work. Again, there are issues with this theory. If this was the case, why would they continue it on for years if James wasn't disturbed by Jeff? And why make the figure of Jeff become a fun and playful character to be around? There is also the point that James makes time and time again that the reports of Jeff were making it impossible to sell the farm. Which brings us onto the topic of money. Now, every time I talk about a paranormal case, there will be comments saying that the people involved are just after money. I admit I have a tendency to roll my eyes at these comments. The amount of people who have made any sort of significant money off a reported haunted house is so tiny in comparison to the people who are instead ridiculed and end up causing genuine damage to their lives for going public with such wild claims. However, that doesn't mean there aren't examples of people at least trying this bizarrely risky get-rich-quick scheme, and it's hard not to consider it here. Harry Price, at the very least, was suspicious that James Irving was very interested in making money from the Jeff story. The Irvings were not well off by any stretch of the imagination, and the idea that they may have missed their more financially stable life in Liverpool can't be denied. Although, when they realised the chances of making a profit on their property was dwindling, and the discovery that there wasn't any money to be made off of book sales for this case, you have to wonder why they would stick to it for so long. Ultimately, James Irving passed away, a poor man, on a farm in the middle of nowhere, and the family lost a considerable amount of money just to get rid of the place after he passed. Was Jeff simply a joke that they took too far? A fantastical figure that the family had conjured up one bored night on the farm? A way for the Irvings to entertain their daughter with tall tales of a talking weasel? Maybe they worked out ways to make sound travel around the house easily, much as Price had suggested. Maybe Vori could throw her voice. Maybe other members of the family could. It's not hard to notice that Jeff seems to share a lot of the family's interests and personality traits at times. Together they concocted this prank just for the devilment of it, as Jeff would say. And maybe James Irving got carried away, trying to see how far he could push this story, how many people he could fool, just for attention, or maybe to brighten up what could be a very dull life on the farm. To me, this feels the most likely, but I can't shake Vori's later life from all of this. She seems to genuinely feel that Jeff had been a hugely negative impact on her life, that it is a part of her life that she wanted to ignore, that she didn't want people to keep asking about it. But if that were the case, why, once she left the farm, or certainly after her parents passed, could she have just not told the truth? No one had made any significant money from Jeff. There was nothing to gain from keeping the story alive. If she despised it so much, she could have told her side, likely made a bit of cash for the interview, and then she could have moved on with her life, never thinking about Jeff again. But she didn't. She refused to talk about him, and when she finally did cave some 30 years later, she gave one single interview where she doubled down on it being true, and then went silent again. So many people came to Dawlish Cushen over the years, hearing this ridiculous story. So many came specifically to disprove it, to see what nonsense this family were conjuring up. But so many left as believers, if not convinced that Jeff existed, at least convinced that the family genuinely believed that Jeff existed. But not one of them could come to a conclusive view of what Jeff could be. So let's get into some more out there theories. Jeff is a ghost, a poltergeist, or some kind of other spirit. A lot of the phenomena involved with Jeff is quite different to what we expect to hear in a haunted house story. But I couldn't help but notice similarities to many much older paranormal cases. Most famously, the tale of the Bell Witch features several connections, not least of which is the mysterious voice that filled the family's home. This is also present in another much older case that took place at Wizard Clip, a topic I have already covered on the show. The more I read, the more it brought these cases to mind. Much like Jeff, many cases of hauntings are said to start with rappings, gentle taps on the wall that grow louder and more violent the more they are paid attention to. Animal apparitions have also been reported in many paranormal cases over the centuries. In more than one occasion, entities have apparently been referred to by the name of Jeff too, such as in the Willington Mill poltergeist case. There is also the connection I previously mentioned of a young girl being at the centre of the activity, a common trait of many poltergeist cases. There are those who believe a poltergeist isn't a spirit at all. Instead, it is some sort of undiscovered psychic energy that people are capable of producing, often unconsciously. They don't have any control over it and have no idea they are the cause, but they are. This is often suspected as most likely happening during puberty. If Vori had been the cause of Jeff, then maybe it makes sense that his appearance became less frequent as she grew tired of her little companion. before eventually disappearing completely when she left the farm. Along the lines of the human mind being responsible for such a phenomenon, there is of course Nandor Fodor's suggestion that it was in fact James who created Jeff. That somehow Jeff was a physical manifestation of a bored and frustrated mind. Or another view along the same lines is that Jeff could be a tulpa, an entity created simply because the Irvings did really believe in him. This is an interesting line of thought to get lost in when you recall how many times Jeff grew angry when people did not believe in him. Maybe that very belief is what he needed to exist. Then there are ideas that are more based in folklore. Of course, the obvious comparison is to a witch's familiar, a theme that seemed to be brought up by many who investigated the case. There are also plenty of creatures in British folklore that resemble elements of the Jeff story, many of which are variations on the idea of the fairy or the fae. The Isle of Man by itself has many tales of tricky, mischievous creatures, toying with people, but also being helpful when treated well by the locals. These are often seen as trickster-like entities, a name used for a few different concepts within the paranormal, but normally used to refer to a being whose purpose is to confuse, to frustrate, and to disrupt our ordinary way of life, much like Jeff had done to the Irving family. If Jeff were literally real or not feels almost redundant by this point. The more interesting question, I'd argue, was if he was real to all those people who came to Dawlish Kashen. Was he the work of bored minds, a supernatural entity, or was he in fact just an extra special mongoose? We will never know for certain, and part of me is glad for that fact. The world is just that little bit more magical, knowing that Jeff was a part of it, whatever he may have been. That's all for this entry into the tape library. I'm not sure how long this episode will end up being, but at the time of writing this, I've spent the better part of a week manically writing over 13,000 words on the tale of a talking mongoose. It has made me question my sanity at times, and has certainly made me ask one or two questions about my life choices. But I'm genuinely so glad I finally got round to this one. It feels almost like a fever dream at this point. Jeff is one of those stories I've had on my list since the show pretty much started, but I kept putting it off because I really wanted to make sure I did it right. So I hope I've done the story of this extra special mongoose justice. I know this is a really odd one, and I'm sure a lot of people will have checked out a while ago, but if you came along for the ride, then thank you. I stand by my belief that this is one of the most entertaining and unique pieces of Fortean history to ever exist. Price and Lambert's book is a very rare find due to how few were published, but if you want to dig deeper into this, I can't recommend Christopher Josephy's book Jeff enough. I used a variety of sources for this, but in hindsight that was pointless. I found myself coming back to this book to confirm pretty much every detail. At close to 400 pages, it's a big commitment, but it has every single detail you could ever hope to learn about this case. I'm not sponsored by the book at all, but I genuinely think it is one of the best books I have read on paranormal cases since I started doing this. Really can't recommend it enough. I'm gonna go and collapse into my own sanctum now and hibernate for a while. Hopefully all those dreams of Jeff will stop soon. But if you enjoyed this mammoth episode, then please do click like and subscribe if you haven't already. Pleasant dreams. This is the terrifying case of the Summerwind Mansion.
Never forget their faces. And I've never talked to them again.
What area of the house you were in, you were watched?
He quit talking. He wouldn't answer a question. He kept looking around the rooms. He kept walking around the rooms.
I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't tell him what I had seen.
Ginger lay there, wondering how it had gotten to this point. The gentle sounds of the lake lapping at the nearby shore, the tree branches providing her a kind of natural ceiling. the moon shining down from above. But this wasn't a camping trip. Ginger was curled up on the dirty ground below, desperately trying to stay warm. She needed sleep. She was so desperate for sleep. She looked up, staring through the tree line, at her house. Inside were her family, her bedroom, her bed. But she couldn't bring herself to go back inside. It's not like she would be getting any sleep in there either anyway. And at least out here she was safe. But that was when it hit her. She was safe. Her children, on the other hand, were still inside with it. Whatever it was. Yet still she couldn't bring herself to stand up and walk back inside. Just one more night sleeping in the woods. Just one more. Once I can finally get some sleep, I can figure out what to do. My mind will be clear. I will find a solution to the nightmare that is our home. Inside, no one else was asleep either. In their beds, the children lay there, covering their ears and crying. Downstairs, her husband hammered on the keys of his organ, sweating, screaming, lost to madness. Tonight we're heading down to the Land O'Lakes for a good old-fashioned haunted house story. And who knows, maybe a friend might come along for the ride. Welcome to the tape library. Get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. This is the terrifying story of the Summerwind Mansion. Before we jump into this, I haven't asked this question for a long time, so I'm curious about the responses. Have you ever experienced something that you believe could be paranormal? You don't have to give a detailed answer, but I'd love to hear at least a yes or no in the comments below. If you want to share your story after the episode though, please feel free. It's always nice when someone brings a little tale to our digital campfire here. Okay, where to start with Summerwind? I would say we would start at the beginning, although, as with many aspects of this tale, that is a little unclear. We know the beginnings of the house itself, but what if something was already there, tainting the very land it stood on? Well, that is a little harder to answer, but hopefully we can get into that a little later. It wasn't always known as Summerwind. In fact, for the longest time it was known as the Old Lamont Mansion, due to the house's original owner, Robert Patterson Lamont. Lamont was a wealthy and very successful man from Detroit, Michigan. In the late 1800s, Lamont moved to Chicago. There he met his wife, Helen Gertrude Trotter, and together they had 3 children. Due to his work as vice president of the Simplex Railway Appliance Company, Lamont often found himself traveling between the busy streets of Chicago to the equally chaotic halls of Washington, D.C., a place where he would make many connections. But Lamont needed an escape from this life. He wanted somewhere quiet and clean to raise his children, and that is when he set his heart on the idea of a lavish summer getaway, somewhere that could be his sanctuary away from the life that he was currently leading. That is when he discovered Land O'Lakes, although it wouldn't have been called that back in 1916, when Lamont first discovered the place. It was a small town in Wisconsin, on the banks of a beautiful series of lakes. The population, especially back then, was tiny, but Land O'Lakes had become a popular destination for the wealthy to escape the city. It was while there that he found a beautiful plot of land on the banks of West Bay Lake. At the time it was being used to house a hotel and 4 small cottages for summer vacations. But Lamont instantly got the vision in his mind of a grand, beautiful mansion that he could call his own. Lamont purchased the land from the family that owned it, and hired an architectural firm from Chicago to build it. After 2 years it was complete, a beautiful building containing 20 rooms and multiple outbuildings, scattered across the land that cost Lamont $125,000 to complete. He called it Lilac Hills. Lamont was immensely proud of this home, even inviting President Warren G. Harding to come and stay. Lamont's personal successes would continue to grow while owning Summerwind, seeing him ultimately become the Secretary of Commerce for President Herbert Hoover. He would be one of the few residents to not apparently suffer the supposed curse of this mansion. While the Lamonts spent many happy years in the mansion, there was always the small niggling that something was wrong. Very quickly after moving in, the family hired several servants, many of whom stayed in the outbuildings, to maintain the property. It all started with smells. The servants would come to Helen and tell her they kept smelling odd odours coming from the inside of the mansion, but could never identify the source of the smells. Then there were the sounds. Whispers in the halls, footsteps where no one should be. The maids quickly began talking about how they believed that the house was haunted, but Robert's wife simply laughed off these suggestions. The house was brand new. How on earth could it be haunted, if such a thing were even possible? The Lamonts never gave much credence to these claims by their servants, although you have to wonder what they experienced themselves. Did they hear the sounds? Did they smell the odours? Did they feel the sense that they were being watched wherever they went? We don't know, and the reason for that is that Robert Lamont apparently never liked to talk about his experience of living at Lilac Hills, this beautiful mansion that he loved so dearly. And in fact, in the 1930s, the Lamont family abandoned the mansion, never to return. The incident that led to the Lamonts leaving has been a part of the folklore of Summerwind for so long now, the origin of it is lost to time. Apparently the reason this story exists though, is that Lamont told a few of his drinking buddies the tale of what happened on that last night, and then never told another soul until his death in 1948. The Lamont family had owned the mansion for around 15 years at this point. It was one night in the early 1930s. Robert and Helen were sitting alone in their kitchen. They had just returned from a meal and were having a dessert at the table before heading off to bed. Helen paused for a moment. Robert asked what was wrong, but she shrugged it off and said nothing. They continued eating before she then suddenly stopped again. She was sure this time. She had heard something. Helen glanced around the room. Then she heard it again. Louder this time. Loud enough that Robert noticed it too. It was the door to the basement. It was rattling. The pair didn't say a word at first, they just stared at the basement door, curious as to what could be making the sound, when it suddenly began to shake, violently. Someone was trying to get through the basement door and up into the kitchen. Robert jumped up and grabbed his pistol, slowly edging towards the door, its handle jolting up and down, the hinges almost buckling from the force of whatever it was pushing on it. Helen hid behind her husband. Robert shouted out to ask who was there, but there was no response, just more violent shaking. Then, the door swung open. The Lamonts couldn't believe what they were seeing. Robert later described the sight to his drinking buddies as a ghoul. It looked like a man, but tall, much too tall to be human. Its dark, shadowy form blocked out the entire doorway into the basement. It appeared to be wearing clothes, but they were all black, and the entire thing seemed to drift and sway, as though it were made from smoke. Helen screamed in terror and Robert didn't hesitate. He fired 2 shots into the entity that seemed to just pass through it, hitting the partially open door instead. The Lamonts turned and ran, gathering their family and quickly leaving the property, never to return. There seems to be some confusion about the status of the property throughout the remaining years of the 1930s. It's commonly said that Lamont refused to sell the property, leaving it empty as it slowly began to rot. The family had left numerous antiques and belongings behind that were all pinched by vandals and thieves, who discovered that the mansion had been left. The Lamonts didn't seem to care though. It was as if this once beloved home was dead to them now. However, images exist in a brochure offering people the chance to rent out Lilac Hills. The pictures show the mansion as it looked in the 1930s, although it is possible the brochure is from later and was just using an old photo. Generally though, it appears that the mansion stood empty until Robert Lamont passed away and the Kiefer family purchased the estate from the remaining Lamonts. If the Kiefer family ever lived in the property is also a little unclear, but they are said to be the first recorded victims of the curse of Summerwind. Within 6 months of owning the property, Mr. Kiefer dropped dead, unexpectedly. The family couldn't afford the upkeep of the land, so Miss Kiefer began selling off sections of the estate to different buyers. By the time the 1960s rolled around, All that remained in her possession was the land the old Lamont mansion stood on. But it wasn't through lack of trying. Miss Kiefer kept trying to sell the mansion, time and time again. But every time the new buyers wouldn't be able to keep up with the repayments, and the home would revert back to her ownership. It was as though she could get rid of every part of Lilac Hills, except the mansion for some reason. It seemed like Miss Kiefer wasn't especially fond of the property, although she would never reveal why. It appeared she was fearful to even step into it. She would take prospective buyers to the house, hand them the keys and leave them to tour the property themselves. No one who came to Summerwind has ever said that Miss Kiefer accompanied them on the tour. In the summer of 1969, Ginger Hinshaw was visiting a friend in the area. Much like Lamont all those years earlier, Ginger had fallen in love with the Land O'Lakes and was desperate to find herself a home here. She couldn't believe it when her friend took her to see Summerwind. It was run down at this point, a shadow of its former splendour. But for a house this size, it was a total bargain. Ginger had recently remarried and she saw this as the perfect place to make a new start. Her friend, however, warned her that the house had been mostly empty for 40 years, and that the locals had a lot of stories about the property, to the extent that they would refer to it as the old haunted house. Ginger smiled to herself, not taking these stories too seriously, and said, "Well, I guess I'm going to be living in a haunted house." Not long after this, Ginger returned with her husband, Arnold, and 4 children in tow to come and see the house. Miss Kiefer stayed in her car on the drive, but handed the keys over to the couple to take a look around. Arnold, who owned his own construction business, was as taken by the property as Ginger had been. It was stunning. He knew it would need a lot of work, but for the price, this was a no-brainer. They had to buy this house. Ginger's 9-year-old daughter April, though, had a very different view when she walked in. In later life, she spoke about her first impressions of entering the mansion. Its walls stripped of paint and wallpaper, its floors bare and dirty. It was huge, but dingy and decrepit. She couldn't understand why her mother was so obsessed with the place. From the second she entered, it didn't feel like home. In fact, something inside her told her that they shouldn't be there at all. They were not welcome. Within a month, the family moved in. There was a lot of work to do, but with a little help, Arnold and Ginger were sure they could get the place back in shape quickly. But that was where they ran into their first hurdle. They would contact local tradesmen to come and work on the property. Time and time again, they found that the contractors were up for the work, until they told them the address. Then they would suddenly make an excuse why they couldn't do it, or simply not turn up on the day they were due to begin work. Even getting supplies to the house seemed odd. Delivery drivers wouldn't even drive up the path to the house itself, instead just leaving packages at the gate outside. It was as if none of the locals even wanted to step near the old Lamont mansion. But the newly married couple weren't afraid of a bit of hard work, and set about fixing up the mansion themselves anyway. They restored the fireplace mantle, wallpapered all the rooms, and began restoring the hardwood floors. It was during this time that Ginger made an unusual discovery. She was looking through one of the built-in wardrobes in an upstairs room, when she found a large rolled-up piece of paper. She unravelled it to discover the original blueprints of the mansion, but strangely, there was a Native American peace pipe within the rolled-up blueprints. A little strange, but she had heard stories about how the previous owners had filled the home with many interesting artifacts. This apparently was just one of the few that wasn't looted over its derelict years. The blueprints, though, seemed to have a more profound impact on Ginger. After looking at them, she said her attitude towards fixing up the house changed. This wasn't just about making a nice home for her family anymore. Ginger claimed that she became practically obsessed with restoring the mansion to its former self, making it identical to the home the Lamonts had created. She would spend days comparing paints, trying to find the right one that matched what little still remained on the walls. She said it was like something was guiding her, as though she were no longer in full control of how she decorated the rooms. Interestingly, at the same time, Arnold's interest in restoring the house took the complete opposite direction. He became increasingly unenthusiastic about the whole thing. Ginger noted that he was constantly distracted. He would go to do a job but couldn't keep his focus on that task for more than a few minutes. But Ginger seemingly didn't care. She was single-minded and carried on the work that she felt needed to be done. Soon after moving in, the children began coming to Ginger, saying they felt scared in the house. They claimed it felt like they were being watched at all times, as though they were never alone in any room of the mansion. Ginger would have likely just brushed this off as just the children being unsettled by the move. But she too had begun to notice things. Chairs would seem to move across the kitchen floor when no one was looking, and she too felt like she was never truly alone in the house. But it wasn't just a feeling. She would hear the creaking of floorboards, as though someone were walking around upstairs. She could easily pass this off as noises of an old house, but the whispering behind the closed doors was a little harder to explain. She would become convinced that she could hear voices in the rooms upstairs, but when she looked inside, no one would be in there. But surely it was just the talk of ghosts messing with her mind, and that's what she told herself, even when she started to notice the shadows moving out of the corner of her eyes. Arnold noticed them too, as though something were just moving out of the corner of his eye, but when he looked there was nothing there. They would often see lights flickering, and he kind of assumed that was the cause, just faulty electrics. Appliances would often break, but when he would go to fix them, they would work fine again. What couldn't be explained by the electrics of the house though, was what had happened to the car. Arnold was leaving the house to go to a job. When he stepped out of the front door though, his car that was just a few feet away from him burst into flames. Luckily he wasn't hurt, but the car was destroyed. They never did find a reason for why it had happened. Arnold was not entertained in the idea of ghosts though, but ever since he had moved into that house, his personality had completely flipped. He was becoming increasingly withdrawn from his family. The interactions he did have with Ginger and the children were increasingly angry. He would often put his tools down while working, and turn around to discover they had vanished. He was convinced it was the children messing with him, and he became enraged with them every time it happened. He then started rarely going into work, instead spending most of his time inside the mansion. The only thing that seemed to bring him joy was his music. Arnold had purchased an organ not long before the family had moved in, and he had begun playing it. But strangely, only at night. A common source of Arnold's anger was the window in the master bedroom. No matter how many times he shut it, it would always be open again when he would return to the room. Initially, Arnold began blaming the children for this too. Then he decided that Ginger was responsible, and started yelling at her to stop opening the window. He ultimately nailed it shut. Arnold was convinced that Ginger and the children were messing with him, trying to drive him insane. Ginger, meanwhile, believed Arnold was the one moving furniture around and hiding tools. If he was doing this deliberately or not, though, she couldn't say. He seemed so distracted at all times, like his mind was somewhere else. No one seemed to trust each other anymore. One of the stranger reported incidents took place around this time. One summer day, Ginger and Arnold were painting a closet in one of the bedrooms. At the back was a large shoe drawer that had been built into the wall. Arnold pulled it out so he could paint, and noticed a large space behind the drawer. He looked inside with his flashlight, and jumped back when he saw something. He couldn't believe it, but he turned to Ginger and said, "I think there's something dead in there." They assumed it was an animal, but the space was too small for either of them to get inside. So instead, when the children got home from school, they asked one of the girls, Mary, to crawl inside and take a look. Mary crawled in briefly before screaming in terror. She was quickly pulled out by Arnold, and the young girl was in hysterics. She claimed it looked like a person, a human skull with remnants of hair still attached. It seems very unclear about what the family did with this discovery, but seemingly they never contacted the authorities about this potential corpse that was hidden within their walls. It was after this event though that things really turned bad. Arnold's anger grew and grew with each passing week. One of the girls, April, described it as though he were possessed. One of the most upsetting moments for the children involved a pet raccoon that they owned. One night it escaped its cage. Arnold was convinced it was in the woods, and he demanded that the children go out into the woods in the middle of the night to look for it, claiming it was their fault and that he didn't need this extra stress. When the raccoon was finally found, he apparently killed it to, in his words, teach the kids a lesson. April said that their stepfather had previously been a kind, caring man, but suddenly, it was as if he hated the entire family. He felt like an evil presence in their home. Then Arnold just stopped talking. Ginger would see him walking from room to room, staring at things that weren't there. Arnold was convinced that something was in the home now. Something was toying with him, but he didn't know what it was, or what it wanted. The only thing that would bring him peace was playing the organ, something he would do loudly at all times of the night. The apparitions began to become more vivid too. One day Ginger was alone in the house, a rare time that Arnold had actually left, when she became convinced that she heard a voice as she went to walk upstairs. A man's voice, deep and strong, but there was nobody there. Ginger continued walking upstairs. Again she heard something in the upstairs hall, but she wasn't sure what it was. She checked all the rooms, but no one was there. She then heard the voice again, but this time it said her name, before seeing what appeared to be some sort of shadowy human-like figure in the upstairs hall that quickly vanished. This wasn't the only intruder the family were seeing in the home though. Desperate for a bit of normality to be restored to their lives, Ginger invited a couple of friends around for an evening of socializing. Everything had been going great, although Arnold had kept himself secluded away in another part of the house. But she didn't mind. She was just grateful for some adult company, some people to make this strange fantasy they were creating feel silly. Ginger had gone to the kitchen to grab some more wine. When she returned though, she found her guests quite troubled. There was a set of French doors that led out from this room to the kitchen. While she had been gone, her friends had seen a woman walk past those doors. Ginger's friends hadn't recognised the woman, and when they went to look, there was no one there. Ginger instantly knew who they were talking about. She had hoped she was losing her mind, but she had seen her too, on more than one occasion. She never looked like a ghost exactly. She looked like a flesh and blood human woman, just casually walking past the French doors, as though her and her family weren't even there. Ginger wasn't alone. Multiple members of the family had claimed to see her, but she for some reason didn't truly believe it, until her friends claimed to see her too. Apparently her friends were so freaked out by the incident, they immediately left. They refused to take Ginger's calls going forward. She was now even more alone. Arnold at this point became truly gone. He would never leave the house. He would play the organ all night so loud it kept the entire family awake. The songs he played were described by the children as weird and dark. He would play random notes one after another, off-kilter and unsettling sounding tunes that he seemed to be just making up on the spot for hour after hour. After repeated nights of being unable to sleep, Ginger began begging him to stop, but Arnold said he couldn't. He had to keep playing. The voices he could hear wanted him to keep playing. This was when Ginger began taking herself off into the woods at night. She couldn't explain exactly what had drawn her to them, but it was likely just a desperate need to escape the constant nighttime racket of Arnold's playing. She too was beginning to lose her mind. The sleep deprivation wasn't helping. Whenever she was in the house, she just felt like something was hanging over her, watching her every move. She heard it whispering to her, moving around just out of sight. What's more, she became convinced that the house was changing. Hallways seemed to grow longer as she walked down them. The walls blurred and shifted. It wasn't possible though. It was all in her head. But she felt safer out in the cold woods than she did inside that house. It was in these nighttime outings that Ginger's mind went to a darker place. She considered ending it all, taking her own life. She couldn't handle it anymore. She felt trapped. She couldn't think straight. How had this all gone so wrong? Ginger didn't know it, but she wasn't the only one feeling this way. April stated in a later interview that she and her sister had both discussed the idea of ending their lives too. The atmosphere in the house was so oppressive that now even the young children were considering stepping into the void. It was when winter hit that Ginger finally met her breaking point. She remembers the sound of the cold winter wind so vividly that the sound of wind still scares her to this day. Arnold no longer spoke to anyone. His business was gone, and the family had no money left. The electricity and heating had been cut off due to unpaid bills. A water pump had broken. Arnold was too mentally checked out to fix it, and no contractors would step foot near the house. So Ginger and the children had begun bringing up buckets of water from the lake. The nights had grown so cold they were forced to bring their mattresses and bedding down to the living room so they could all huddle around the fire. Ginger was also becoming increasingly worried that Arnold would end up hurting one of the children. She had previously been too proud to contact her parents and ask for help, but she knew, looking at her family huddled together for warmth, that this had already gone past the point where things like that mattered. She rang her father, and the following day he showed up with a camper van to take Ginger and the children away. April said in a later interview that the moment they stepped out of that house and drove away, it felt like a war had ended. All the dark thoughts faded away. She was free to simply be a child again. Arnold did not leave with them though. He watched from the window as his new family drove off into the distance, and he remained in Summerwind. To my knowledge, Arnold has never spoken about what took place in the house publicly. But soon after his family left, he too left Summerwind for good, checking himself into a mental health facility once he was away from the mansion. He and Ginger divorced soon after, but it seemed no one in the family ever saw Arnold in person again after they left him behind in that mansion. But this wasn't the end of the Summerwind story. Ginger told her father, Raymond Bober, everything that happened in the house, but he didn't believe a word of it. He knew his daughter and his grandchildren had been through a very real trauma, but ghosts? In his mind, Arnold was just not the man she thought he was when they had gotten married. The man was clearly unwell, and his madness had simply affected the rest of them. Ginger, a once skeptic herself though, was now firmly in the believer camp, and over the following years became increasingly obsessed with the paranormal, reading everything she could to try and explain what she had experienced in that mansion. Her father Raymond, however, also became a little obsessed. For some reason, even though 3 years had passed, he couldn't seem to get Summerwind out of his head either. One day he arranged to go and visit the property, taking along his son, Ray Jr. as well. The new owner, who was already looking to sell the mansion, handed Raymond the keys and told him to feel free to look around. She didn't want to get out of the car for some reason. Raymond was instantly captivated by the place. He said it felt like it was in need of love, like a puppy that had been left out in the rain. He had this insatiable urge to care for it, to look after it, to restore it to its former glory. Strangely, Ray Jr. would later say he felt the exact same as they toured the mansion. The last 3 years had not been kind to the property. It had been left empty since Ginger left, and the weather had seemingly taken a toll on it. It looked like the property had been abandoned for decades, not just a few years. But Raymond saw potential. He wanted to buy it and turn it into a hotel and restaurant. Ray Jr. had recently got back from Vietnam, and his father was keen to find something for his son to work on, to reintegrate him back into normal life. Between the two of them, they believed they had enough experience to take on this project. But even from the first time walking around the house, Raymond was unable to shake his daughter's stories. It was all just in his mind, but he still noticed that odd feeling. That feeling of being watched. Raymond broke the news to Ginger, and she was obviously unimpressed by his plans. The children too were worried, scared for the safety of their uncle and grandfather. But Raymond ignored their concerns and purchased the property. Soon after, Ray Jr. began working on the place. He quickly ran into the same issue that Ginger and Arnold were having. Though other contractors would come out to work on the property, he would be alone for much of this endeavour. Raymond also tried to get contractors to come and get involved, but with no luck. Raymond decided to get some initial measurements of the place done, but when he compared the measurements of the rooms to the original blueprint that Ginger had found, he discovered that none of them matched up. In fact, some rooms were double the size listed on the original blueprint, as though the property had grown since the building had been completed. Stranger still, when he remeasured a room, it came out a slightly different size to what he had initially noted down. Obviously a simple mistake, but this kept happening, time and time again, as if the house were constantly expanding and contracting, on any given day being a different size than the previous day, almost as though the house were alive. It was during this time that Raymond came across a sign that read Summerwind, practically buried in the overgrown bushes outside, suggesting this had been the name of the property at some point, although it's unclear when this was the case. Either way, this discovery is why the property is referred to as Summerwind today. After discovering the sign, Raymond looked up at the house and noticed the window in the master bedroom was wide open. Strange, he thought to himself. He was sure he remembered shutting it. Ray Jr. was planning to work on the place for a few days, so he took his father's camper van with him. The house was too run down, so he decided he would sleep in the camper van at night and work during the day. He worked throughout that first day without any incidents, but that evening he was sitting outside the van enjoying a beer when he became convinced that he heard a growl. Ray Jr. froze, desperately trying to keep an ear out for the sound, and sure enough, it came again, clearer this time. It was 100% a growl, and it was close. Convinced that it must be bears, Ray Jr. locked himself in the camper van that night. The next day, a thunderstorm hit the area, and Ray Jr. was left on his own on a miserable, rainy day inside Summerwind. But the sounds didn't stop. In fact, they got stranger. Ray Jr. began to follow one of the sounds. A few hours later, Ray Jr. walked into his father's home. Raymond asked his son what he was doing back there. He'd been planning to stay at Summerwind for a few days. Ray Jr. got extremely sheepish and didn't want to talk about it, simply claiming that all his tools weren't working and that he was unable to do anything before rushing off into the other room. Raymond knew that something was wrong with his son. First Ginger, now Ray Jr. Something was off about Summerwind, and he wanted to get to the bottom of it. He ended up getting in touch with the prior owner, and she was happy to lay out what she knew about the history of the house, which is how Raymond came to learn about the Lamonts, and the incident where Robert Lamont had attempted to shoot an entity that he saw in his kitchen. All of this sent Raymond's head spinning. Maybe he had been too quick to dismiss his daughter's claims about the paranormal goings-on. But this didn't stop him from pushing on with his plans. A few nights later, Raymond and Ray Jr. were sitting with Ginger, talking through what they were going to do. Raymond had drawn up new blueprints for his planned hotel and was talking Ginger through them, when Ginger noticed that her brother's leg was shaking up and down, and he was violently biting his nails. Ginger asked what was wrong, and her brother said that he had just developed this habit recently. He couldn't stop biting his nails. Ginger could see he was clearly agitated by something, but she had a suggestion for him. She had recently been experimenting with learning hypnosis, and she believed, if he would let her, that she could help him stop this nail-biting habit. Ray Jr. agreed, and Ginger held up a pen, asking her brother to focus on it, as she softly spoke to him. Unbeknownst to her, April had overheard the conversation and had crept downstairs, listening in to the whole thing. Once Ray Jr. was under, Ginger started asking him about the mansion. As soon as the topic was brought up, his leg began shaking again. But then something weirder happened. Ray Jr. started speaking in a voice that didn't sound like his own. He kept repeating the same few sentences over and over, his leg violently bumping up and down as he did, almost growling as he spoke. Ginger kept trying to bring him back around, but she couldn't, the voice growing angrier and more aggressive as it went. Eventually, Ray Jr. snapped out of it, and he came back around. He didn't believe Ginger when she told him what happened, but she was able to prove it to him. They had recorded the session. Ginger played the tape back to her brother so he could hear it all. In this rough old voice that didn't sound like his own, Ray Jr. had claimed he was very old. He claimed that he despised weakness. He hated his children, of which he claimed to have 7, although Ray Jr. didn't have any children of his own. Then he kept repeating over and over that his children were weak and that he was very strong, repeating this weird angry statement over and over until Ginger was able to bring him back around. As the tape ended, Ray Jr. was left shaking and disturbed. He looked up at his sister and father and decided it was time to tell them what made him leave Summerwind the other day. Ray Jr. had walked upstairs to the master bedroom to find someone had left the window wide open. He didn't remember opening it the day before, but he was sure he must have. Either way, due to the thunderstorm outside, rain had been pouring in through the window for quite some time, soaking the floor and leaking out into the hall. Ray shut the window and grabbed a mop, drying first the bedroom before moving out into the hall. He began mopping the floor along the hall, but it was like the water stretched deeper into the house than it should. How had it got all the way down the hall like this? Ray kept mopping and mopping. He said it felt like the hall was getting longer and longer as he walked along with his mop. But he did eventually reach the end. Ray sighed. He was clearly just tired. After the growling sounds, he hadn't gotten much sleep the night before. Ray grabbed his mop and went to head back downstairs when he noticed it. Through the doorway into the master bedroom, he could see the window was open yet again. Rain pouring in. Ray rushed back, slamming the window shut, and began mopping yet again. And then he heard it. A voice. A voice he was sure had just called his name. Ray Jr. shouted out, asking who was there. He tried to assure himself that maybe his father had showed up, but when he heard the voice again, he knew he didn't recognize it. He thought it was coming from the stairs, so Ray Jr. cautiously walked to the top of them to look down. There was no one. Ray Jr. jumped 6 feet in the air though when he heard 2 sudden loud bangs. Instinctively, he rushed downstairs to the source of the sounds. It was only as he entered the kitchen that he smelt it. Gunpowder. Then he realized it had sounded like a gun had gone off. Suddenly concerned he could be in very real danger here from a possible trespasser, Ray quickly scouted the house and the area directly outside, but could find no trace of anyone. He returned to the kitchen, and that's when he noticed them. 2 small holes in the basement door. They kind of looked like bullet holes. Then, he heard them again. The voices. Ray turned around from the door and he saw something in the kitchen. Something that he struggled to put into words. A shape, a figure. It began rushing towards him. Ray ran as fast as he could, jumped into the camper van and drove back home. He didn't believe in ghosts before, but he did now. Hearing his son's story, Raymond instantly made the connection to the Lamonts and the incident in their kitchen. But this is where the story takes a slightly strange turn. Raymond started to believe now that this was all real, but he didn't see it as something negative. He thought there was something in the house attempting to communicate with them. Raymond asked Ginger to now try the hypnosis on him to see if he too was carrying around any subconscious information about the house. It took Raymond a little longer to fall under the hypnosis, but when he did, he began to describe a vision he was having. He saw himself inside the halls of Summerwind, walking through, headed to the kitchen and down into the basement. While there, he crouched down next to a wall and pulled out a loose brick from the base of the wall. Behind the brick was a gap that seemed to be left there on purpose. He then pulled a small box out. Inside the box was what appeared to be a land grant, dated 1767. The name of the owner read Jonathan Carver. When Raymond came to, he claimed he had no memory of the vision he had just described to his children, nor did he recognize the name Jonathan Carver. But the next day, Raymond headed to the library and began his research. Sure enough, Jonathan Carver was a very real man, an explorer who had been in the area during the 1700s. It was said he had helped arrange a peace deal between two warring Native American tribes. As a thank you, Carver had been given the deed to a piece of land by one of the tribes. This was the very land that Summerwind Mansion now stood on. However, it seemed that Carver's descendants were never able to find the document that proved the land was theirs. Ginger became convinced that the ghosts were attempting to communicate this to them, that it was their job to find Carver's deed. The three of them then returned to Summerwind the next day, and sure enough, they found the loose brick in the wall in the basement. It was clear that something had been kept in there, but no sign of the box from her father's vision could be found. They searched the house from top to bottom for hours, but couldn't find anything. Defeated, the trio left Summerwind that day, never to return, leaving the mystery unsolved. In 1982, the property was sold yet again. Its new owners were warned of the responsibility of taking on Summerwind, but much like everyone else, they simply laughed it all off. They had plans to turn it into a bed and breakfast, but it was never to be. On Father's Day in 1988, a thunderstorm hit the area. The official verdict from the fire department was that lightning had hit the mansion, likely multiple times, starting a fire. It burnt Summerwind Mansion to the ground, leaving behind just its imposing large chimney stacks as a lasting monument to the beautiful house that had once stood there. Over the years, the legend of Summerwind has grown and grown, and to this day paranormal investigators still visit the site, hoping to experience something for themselves. It seems the area has a profound effect on those that visit, with many claiming to feel sick when they enter the former grounds of the mansion. Others claim to hear strange sounds, and some even see someone. But more often than not, it would appear whatever is still residing in the shadow of Summerwind is not Jonathan Carver at all. Even before the mansion would burn down, people would claim to see her. A woman staring out of one of the windows, looking down. Potentially the same woman that had paced up and down outside Ginger's kitchen. To this day, this woman is one of the more widely reported sightings at Summerwind. But who is she? Well, to get into that, there appears to be a secondary piece of folklore surrounding the Lamont family and their history with this property. But I thought I would get my good friend Cody from Mystery Archives to tell you all about that.
They call her Lilac Lucy, and her story is a tragic one that paints a very different picture of Robert Lamont. Just outside of Atlanta, Georgia, stood the Whitehall Plantation. The home had fallen on hard times after the Civil War. The family who owned it, a once powerful one, were now forced to use their own daughters to bring in funds. Luckily, the family from the north had a proposal for them. One of these daughters, Lucy, was to become the mistress of a powerful New York banker by the name of Lamont. While he used her for sex, he had no desire to keep her as his wife, and instead came up with a new arrangement for her family. In the end, it was agreed Lucy would marry Lamont's son, Robert, and the Lamont family would purchase the plantation as a part of this deal. Robert Lamont lived with Lucy for a while on the plantation in this strange arranged marriage. They then moved to New York together. Lucy thrived in New York, learning languages, the harp, and becoming ingrained in high society. But her husband was still a stranger to her, a distant man who she rarely saw, a representation of a family that had taken her away from her home. Her only remaining connection to that home was a servant she had been allowed to bring with her, named Hannah. Robert then decided he had had enough of his busy city life. He wanted to move again, and that's when he discovered the Land O'Lakes and the plot of land he would eventually build his mansion on. By this point, Lucy was pregnant and gave birth to a son shortly after moving to Lilac Hills. But while there, Robert changed. Lucy preferred it when he had been a distant husband, because now he was around more often. She saw how controlling Robert could be. Robert basically kept her as a prisoner, rarely letting her leave the mansion, keeping her locked away from the public eye. Even when people came to visit, Robert would drive them away, cutting off all social interaction that Lucy could have. She then gave birth to a daughter who died shortly after being born. It is said that they buried that baby on the property, but that no grave was put up for her. The only contact she had with the outside world was letters she would send her family back in Georgia, begging them to come and see her, but they never did. She had no idea if they even received the letters. In these letters, she painted a slightly terrifying portrait of Lilac Hills, one that went beyond just the cruelness of Robert. She spoke of screams in the middle of the night and hearing voices, that the maids would find themselves covered in strange bruises, that her son was acting strangely, as though he could see things that weren't really there. The wine cellar in the basement was the room that scared her and the servants the most. The entrance had been bricked over, but there were shackles on the walls. It appeared that Lamont had built his own jail cell. Lucy wasn't sure who he intended to keep in there, but she didn't want to find out. Over time, Lucy befriended the overseer of the property, John Whittington. He agreed to help Lucy escape, and along with Lucy's servant Hannah and her son, they fled the property one day. But Lamont tracked them down quickly, and the group was found in Virginia. Lucy had been attempting to get back to her family in Georgia. The fates of Hannah and John are apparently another detail that is lost to history. Lucy was dragged back to Land O'Lakes, and supposedly she was never heard from again. That was until a few years later, when one local claimed to have spotted her, pale, skinny, and old beyond her years. No one knows what happened to Lucy, but when Robert Lamont abandoned Lilac Hills on that night in the 1930s, it appears she did not leave with him. Her son James grew to become quite a troubled young man. Despite his wealthy family, in his adult life, he would be seen working at a nearby gas station. When someone once asked about his mother, James's face went deathly pale. He wouldn't speak about her, but he warned them to never visit the mansion. This story originates from a woman named Emily Forsyth Warren, who grew up on West Bay Lake. Emily was always told to avoid the mansion, although she did claim to have ended up taking refuge within its walls one day when an unexpected storm rolled in while out playing on the lake with her friends. While inside, she is convinced they saw the ghost of Miss Lucy. Could this be the female spirit that many have claimed to see over the years? Although most of the people who have had experiences with this spirit have described her as a friendly entity. Lucy's letters and the reported male voices that have been heard, however, suggest that something far more evil and older is lurking within the soil beneath Summerwind Mansion.
So what really happened? Summerwind feels like a really confusing mix of local folklore, real-life history, and potentially a few people muddying the waters of reality and fiction. The original account I laid out of Lamont building the home for his wife and family appears to be the more historically accurate. There doesn't appear to be much evidence to the existence of Lucy, beyond stories told by locals. However, that's not to say it isn't true. We know for a fact that Robert was married to Helen, but could he have been a bigamist? Or even possibly had Lucy as a mistress that he kept locked away in his own private summer retreat, away from prying eyes and his family. Either way, neither story appears to be the origin of the hauntings. If there is truly something haunting Summerwind, it appears to predate either version of the Lamont story. There is a genuinely strange history to the place. Why the Lamont family would up and leave this house that they loved so much, and then seemingly act as though they never even lived there, is a little eerie. A photograph of the basement door was famously taken in the 1980s, before the property burned down, which did appear to show 2 small holes in it. But when the investigator who took the photo returned a few weeks later, someone had taken the entire door, so we have no way of knowing if these holes were recent, or evidence that backs up the Lamont story. Even if the door hadn't been apparently stolen, it would have likely perished in the fire a few years later anyway. Where the waters really get muddied for me though is the arrival of the Hinshaws in 1969. In recent years, the story of the Hinshaws grew more famous after their appearance on the television show, A Haunting, where they spoke about their experiences firsthand, and for as far as I can tell, the first time in years. The story had also previously appeared in a copy of Life magazine, but the more notable retelling comes from the 1979 book, The Carver Effect, by an author by the name of Wolfgang von Bober. In this, the story of the Hinshaws is laid out, along with Raymond's experience with apparently channeling the spirit of Jonathan Carver, something that he apparently claimed continued on for years, even after failing to find the box. He said he continued communicating with Carver, using a variety of different techniques to talk to the dead. If you hadn't guessed already, Wolfgang von Bober was the pen name of Raymond Bober, who had written the book himself. At this point, it becomes hard not to notice certain similarities. A house with a checkered history, a seemingly innocent family moves in and is haunted by ghosts that ultimately turn the husband insane. Even the casual mentions of Native American tribes and artifacts, it all sounds a little similar to the Amityville haunting, the book of which was released a few years before Raymond's, and was obviously a huge hit. But had Raymond concocted the story himself completely to try and sell a book? Or had he taken something that really happened to his family and twisted a few details to make it a more enjoyable story? If the story were totally false, then I do wonder why they would all go on TV in 2005 to repeat the claims of a long out-of-print book. Raymond's writing career never appears to have taken off, so it kind of feels like there was nothing to gain from reliving the whole thing. Especially for April, who was simply a kid back then, and could have just kept her head down if her family had made up a story about a haunting. I struggle to buy into the whole vision of Jonathan Carver aspect of the story, and very little evidence appears to back up this narrative, and the idea of the family finding the body in the walls, but not going to the police, seems a little too out there, considering no one else ever saw this body. But what about the actual haunting that Ginger claimed to experience? Was there any truth to this? Or was it simply the effect of sharing the house with a husband who was clearly having some very serious mental health issues? So what do you think? Let me know in the comments what you make of this one. A family taking the strange history of their new home to try and kickstart another Amityville style legend? Or was there something to it? Were the Lamont family really chased out by something in their basement? Was Arnold really driven insane by spirits? Did Jonathan Carver really communicate with Raymond? Is there still something residing in the wreckage? of Summerwind Mansion. That's all for this entry into the tape library. It's been a long time since we got into a straight up haunted house story, and I know these are a favourite for a lot of you, so I hope you enjoyed this one. Of course, I've already mentioned the episode of A Haunting on the Summerwind House. You can find that on YouTube if you want to delve deeper. Plus, Devon Bell's book Haunted Summerwind, A Ghostly History of a Wisconsin Mansion, was a huge help in putting this one together. It's a short read, but I highly recommend it if you want to learn a bit more. I did really want to read The Carver Effect in full, but the cost of second-hand copies proves a bit of a stumbling block. Also, a huge thank you to Mystery Archives for jumping on and sharing the story of Lilac Lucy. I originally read about this in Devon Bell's book, and while there wasn't a lot of evidence to add to the story, it was just such a creepy little bit of folklore that I couldn't not include it in here. If you aren't familiar with Mystery Archives, he covers a whole host of paranormal topics and is a really talented storyteller. If you like this show, then I'm sure you'll enjoy his too. He also has an episode on Summerwind, if you aren't quite done with this old mansion yet. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future releases. And if you are listening to the podcast version, please consider leaving a review. It really helps me out massively. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams. Despite many of you having some doubts over the updates, this was still your favourite episode of the year, and one I was never expected to be making. This is the return of Sam, the Sandown Clown. The sun was beginning to set as Faye grabbed her belongings and left the stables. It had been a long day of work for the 16-year-old, and she was keen to get back to her family and climb into bed for the night. The stables were far out into the countryside, so she began to walk down the nearby road to get back to the bus stop. She was alone, surrounded on all sides by the tall trees marking the perimeters of the woodland, and thick bushes dotted along the winding, darkened roads. It might have been spring, but there was a chill in the air. That was when she began to notice it. There was a faint buzz, a consistent hum, almost like electricity in the air. Then the air around her seemed to shimmer slightly. She wasn't far from the bus stop now, but still there was no one around. She glanced about, a little uneasy about what was happening, when suddenly she heard a rustling. Then, from the tree line, she saw a tall figure stepping out of the twilight-lit woods. It was him. She hadn't seen him for nearly 9 years, but he was there. The same tattered clothes, the same strange hopping walk, the white painted face. He was standing there looking at her. She couldn't believe her eyes. Sam, the Sandown Clown, was back. Good evening. Tonight's show will be a little different, because unexpectedly, we're going to be talking about an update to one of the most beloved cases I've featured here on the tape library. I hope you're ready for a weird one, because tonight we're getting very weird. The case of the Sandown Clown has fascinated people ever since it made a brief appearance in the UFO Journal back in the 1970s. A truly strange encounter that I think stuck with people because it left so many unanswered questions. The people who reported the encounter kept themselves anonymous, just leaving a strange tale that no one could quite understand. Frustratingly, for years, those of us into the strange and the unexplained were left with just a handful of pages detailing this encounter and nothing else. Well, it seems this has changed. A man has been presenting a series of talks on the Isle of Wight, and he claims he has new information. Paul A.T. Wilson is a writer and folklorist who has been documenting the island's folk stories for a number of years now, and he claims that the anonymous girl who saw Sam has finally made herself known, and it seems there is more to her story than we knew. It appears that Sam has visited her multiple times since. I will talk about how this all came about and a little more about Paul later in the episode.
But of course, we always start with the story here. So get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. It is time to go back to Sandown. This is the return of All Colours Sam. Welcome to the Tape Library. It's very difficult to tell this story without going back to the beginning. This will be a slightly condensed version of the original encounter. I've done a full episode on Sam if you do want to hear my retelling of that in full, but I will be discussing all the main details here, just in a slightly quicker take. For this, I'll be using the original Before article, but also filling in a few details that Paul has brought to light since. If you are already well familiar with the original encounters, and just want to get to the new stuff, then chapter times are available. It was May 1973, when a 7-year-old girl who we know as Faye was playing with a friend of hers in an area close to Lake Common on the Isle of Wight. The two children heard a strange noise. They described it almost like the wailing of an ambulance siren. Curious, they decided to go and investigate. The sound drew them across the golf course and through a hedge that led to a marshy meadow that ran alongside the rarely used at the time Sandown Airport. Curiously, as they entered the field, the sound stopped, but still the children ventured on. There was a small wooden footbridge that crossed over a brook, so the two children walked across it. As they did, they got their first glimpse of something strange. A blue-gloved hand suddenly appeared as they walked across, gripping the edge of the bridge from underneath. Then, out crawled a tall figure. It had its back to the two children, so they didn't get a good look at him at first, but they noticed straight away that he had a notebook in his hands. The creature moved awkwardly as it stepped out into the brook, and as it did, it fumbled the book, dropping it into the water. It splashed about trying to retrieve the notebook, before walking away back onto the banks that surrounded the brook. Still, it did not look back at the children. Instead, it walked off further, in a kind of strange hopping motion. That was when they realised it was headed towards a metallic hut that they somehow hadn't noticed before. The being entered the hut that seemed to have no windows. Something about this scared the children enough that they decided they wanted to leave. They had walked about 50 yards away when they heard a sound. The wailing noise had returned. They turned around to see the being was now standing outside the hut, looking at them. In its hand now was what looked like a black knobbed microphone. The wailing noise was so loud this time it caused the boy to run away, but Faye was less intimidated by the being. The boy, though, was stopped in his tracks when the wailing siren stopped, and instead they heard a voice. It looked like the being was talking into the microphone, but they could hear as if he were right next to them. In fact, later Faye would apparently explain it wasn't like they could hear him exactly. It was like its voice was inside their heads. The voice said, "Hello, are you still there?" The voice was friendly, and the two children felt compelled to now approach the being. I will quote the article here for his description. He was nearly 7 feet tall and had no neck, for his head appeared to be wedged straight onto his shoulders. He wore a yellow pointed hat which interlocked with a red collar of a green tunic. A round black knob was affixed to the top of his hat, and wooden antennae were attached either side. The face had triangular markings for eyes, a brown square of a nose, and motionless yellow lips. Other round markings were on his paper white cheeks, and a fringe of red hair fell onto his forehead. Wooden slats protruded from his sleeves and from below his white trousers. The being still had the notebook, and rather than speak again, he initially began communicating through writing. In the notebook he scribbled a series of words. They were presented in a random order and on different parts of the page, but the being then pointed to each word in the order that it wanted to communicate them, and Faye read it aloud. He said, "Hello, and I am all colours, Sam," notably putting a comma between the words colours and Sam, which has led to years of debate of if he was calling himself Sam or for some reason believed that one of the children was called Sam. Either way, the name Sam has stuck for the being. After this, he did begin to speak again, but this time without the microphone. To quote the article again, his lips did not move and speech was unclear, rather like that of a person who does not open his mouth properly. He asked the children about themselves, so they ventured to ask questions too. They asked about his clothes, which were all ripped, and he told them he only had one set, so he could only wear those. Because of his strange white features, they asked if he was really a man. The answer was a chuckled no. They also asked if he was a ghost. The vague reply was, "Well, not really, but I am in an odd sort of way." "What are you then?" they continued, but only obtained the answer, "You know," with no further explanation. Stranger still, during this entire interaction, Faye claimed that there were two workmen fixing a fence post. They were a little way away, but should have been able to see the children talking to this strange 7-foot being. But they didn't react at all, almost as though neither the children or Sam were actually there. Sam continued to talk with the children, claiming he had no name, which adds weight to him calling the children Sam rather than himself. He told them there were others like him. He also said he was scared of people and was worried they would hurt him. The being seemed peaceful and fearful, rather than anything malevolent. But it then invited the children into his hut. The children were forced to crawl through a flap to get inside. Strangely, Sam was behind them when they crawled through, but was already inside once they'd made it to the other side of the hatch. Sam informed them that this hut was new, he had just made it. The article continues to describe Sam's hut, stating it was across 2 levels. The lower part had plenty of headroom and was wallpapered in blue-green, and covered with a pattern of dials. It also had an electric heater and simple wooden furniture. The upper level was less spacious, and the floor was metallic. He told the children that he fed upon berries, which he collected in the late afternoon. He didn't say where, but did indicate that he had a camp on the mainland that he could go to. He also said that the water from the river could be drunk once it had been cleaned. Once inside the hut, he removed his hat to reveal round white ears and sparse brown hair on his head. Then he showed the children a trick. He placed the berry in his ear, thrust his head forward, and caused the berry to disappear and reappear at one of his odd eyes. Repeating the process, the berry then travelled to his mouth. After around half an hour, the 2 children decided they should leave. They said goodbye to Sam and rushed out of the hut, leaving it behind. They bumped into the groundskeeper after running back to the golf course and told him they had met a ghost, but he just laughed at them. The 2 children kept their experience a secret until 3 weeks later, when Faye finally told her father. At first he was skeptical, but his daughter gave so many details and seemed quite upset when he didn't believe her. He then went and spoke to the boy, who was a lot more reserved but confirmed a number of the details that Faye had reported. Her father went to the location, but could find no sign of Sam or his hut. Her father jumped to the idea that Faye had met an alien, and in his words, was somehow taken into a bubble of alien reality created by this strange personage. The reason for this belief was that the father, who is named Mr. Y in the article, had been encountering numerous UFO sightings over the years prior to Faye's encounter. In fact, he had had one just a few weeks before. More often than not, these were sightings of strange lights in the sky that seemed to follow him. a fact that was backed up by friends of his who had witnessed it too. But one strange encounter he revealed involved him seeing what looked like two large yellow lights, like eyes, in the water of Compton Bay, after being forced to climb a cliff due to a sudden tidal surge that had nearly swept him away. It wasn't that he was just seeing something unexplainable. He genuinely believed whatever this was tracking him, and now it had shown an interest in his daughter. Mr. Y contacted UFO researchers and the Ministry of Defense's UFO desk. His story initially appeared in a reduced form in a US UFO magazine, before the now famous write-up in the Bufora Journal that apparently still doesn't quite tell the whole of Mr. Y's UFO encounters, but gives a decent overview of their experiences. Seemingly, Mr. Y just wanted the story out there. He never went public with his identity, never tried to make any money from it, and for years that was all we had. But it seemed for Mr. Y and his family, this wasn't quite the end of the story. Mr. Y continued to encounter strange things, right up to his death in 2005, apparently keeping detailed records in his diary each time it happened. And as for Faye, sometime around 2019, writer Paul A.T. Wilson was contacted by someone, claiming that their mother was the Faye from the Sandown Clown story, and that she wanted to speak with him. Paul was initially skeptical. He had been fascinated by the story for years and had attempted to track down the family numerous times. Along his journey, several supposed Fays had come forward, but none had convinced him they were the real deal. However, he still agreed to meet with the woman. When he arrived at her home, the woman handed him a large box. Inside was around 60 pages of documents, handwritten letters to Bufora, the original sketches of Sam, even the notebook that Sam had apparently written and drawn pictures in. He couldn't believe it. Was this really Faye? And why come forward with this now? Well, it seems Faye's story with Sam didn't end on that May afternoon, and she had a story to tell Paul. The return of Sam came in 1982, 9 years after the initial sighting. Faye was now a teenager, and as I stated at the start of the episode, she was walking towards a bus stop down a quiet country lane when she heard something. Then, out from the bushes, stepped Sam, moving in the same strange hopping motion. The air around her felt different. There was a faint buzzing that could be heard, and everything seemed to be shimmering slightly. He looked just as she remembered him from all those years ago. He had the same clothes, although they seemed cleaner and less tattered than before. This time he didn't come with a microphone and a book, but with something that kind of resembled a flute with buttons on it. Faye said she wasn't frightened when she saw him, a reaction you may remember she also had on their first encounter. Sam seemed to scare the boy, initially at least, but something about him always made Faye feel comfortable, no matter how otherworldly he may appear. It seemed though that this flute he had wasn't an instrument. Sam could use it to draw. He waved it around, and it created what she described as almost like moving chalk drawings in the air. Why he was doing this seems unclear, although that is a recurring theme in most of the interactions with Sam. They are all tinged with these strange behaviours and odd communications. Sam began to speak. Faye noted that this time his voice was clearer, that it felt less robotic in her mind, although that didn't mean it was straightforward. Sam said he had been keeping an eye on her, that he was glad that they had become friends. Sam led most of the interaction because Faye just didn't seem to know what to say, or how to react. It seems as though she never expected to see Sam again, and now he was there, standing in front of her. She didn't know what to do. Sam continued, informing her that things were better now, that he didn't have to forage for food or hide. Faye asked him what he meant by things being better, but Sam, in classic Sam fashion, didn't elaborate. After standing there with Sam for around 10 minutes, Faye told him she needed to go home, that her family would be worried. Sam nodded his head before saying, "I will see you again 4 more times if you want. Travel safely." Then he turned and hopped away into the tree line, leaving Faye stood there in a stunned silence. She didn't have to wait long for Sam's next appearance. 1 year later, Faye was now 17 years old, and it was a warm summer evening in 1983. Faye had gone to meet up with some friends down the park, sat on a couple of concrete benches. The group were smoking cigarettes and drinking, typical teenager stuff. A half-empty bottle of sherry taken from one of their parents was being passed around. Faye hadn't even had a chance to have a drink when it happened. This time though, it started with a smell. Soil. The overwhelming smell of earth suddenly filled her nostrils, and that was followed by what she described as burnt leaves. Then, everything changed. She was still in the park, still on the concrete bench, but her friends were all gone. The way she described it was that the world had been overlaid with something unseen. The colours of the bushes and grass around her seemed deeper. The shadows from the trees seemed longer and exaggerated. And it was silent. Eerily silent. She said it was like reality had been turned down. Not off. She wasn't somewhere completely beyond the veil. It was like her world had been simply tuned out a little. Then she saw him. That pale white face with its painted features. The tall, slim frame of Sam stood just a few feet away from her in the middle of the path. But this time, he was not alone. Sam had alluded to there being others like him, but now Faye was meeting some of them. Behind Sam stood others. She struggled to make out details of them. She could tell they looked a similar size to Sam, wore similar patchwork-style clothing, but they were hard to look at. Like her eyes couldn't seem to quite focus on them. Some, she said, almost looked like they shimmered, like the air had done on Sam's return, that kind of haze that you see on the horizon on a hot day. She could also hear them. Kind of. She described it not as speech, but chattering to one another. It wasn't like any sound she had heard before, and it felt distorted, like hearing voices through a thick pane of water. In her words, she called it language without meaning. She then noticed something else along the path. Tall, freestanding shapes that appeared to be doorways to other places. Tall enough for the lanky frame of Sam and his buddies to enter. Sam approached her, in a smooth, calm motion, almost as though he were trying not to scare her. Sam simply said, "I'm glad you are here. You are doing well." Again, Faye felt overwhelmed and speechless, but Sam didn't seem bothered by her silence, and instead guided her along the path. As they passed each of the objects, she glanced in at them. Even before looking, she noted that each doorway had its own unique feel, an atmosphere radiating off of them. Through one, she saw something green and bright. Another had what looked like stars in a blackened sky. One shimmered much like the entity seemed to do on occasion. She said each doorway showed her something different. She struggles to remember them all. Mostly she spoke of the feeling each one gave her. Some felt joyous, others cold. But one stuck in her memory. A view of the world from high above. She said she could see Europe, but in her words it had no borders, no barbed wire. As she looked at it, Sam spoke. He said that the world would not end in her lifetime, that there would be no nuclear war, and that Europe would not be split for long. Given the situation at the time, the constant threat of nuclear war, and a clear divide through the continent. It seemed Sam was addressing some of the young girl's deepest concerns for the world, like he knew what she was worrying about, deep down. Then Sam explained, this is the second visit. If she still wants him to come, he will visit her 4 times. She asked Sam why. Why her? Why keep coming back? Sam just nodded. Then she was back. There was no big change, no sounds. She was just back on the bench with her friends, still talking and drinking. Faye asked them how long she had been gone. They all looked confused before they began to laugh. Faye hadn't been anywhere. She had been sat there the whole time. In Faye's mind, she had been gone with Sam for a while, but to them no time had passed at all. The following year brought Sam back for a much shorter, but seemingly very important encounter. It was a cold and drab winter afternoon in Newport. Faye had travelled to the town to meet up with her boyfriend. There were a series of alleyways that run along behind many of the houses in the area, so she decided to take a shortcut down one of them. She started walking, but as she got to a certain point, she felt the odd compulsion to turn and walk a different way. She did. Sure enough, Sam soon appeared, walking out from behind a fence, startling Faye. This time he looked very different. He still stood out with his unnatural tall and stooped posture, but it was like he was more human this time. He was dressed in more normal clothes. He didn't appear to be painted white. He didn't walk in his strange hopping motion. Even his mannerisms and speech patterns seemed to more resemble a normal person. Sam told Faye that he didn't have much time, that he was using up one of his visits to do this. The girl asked him what he meant. Sam said to her, "I know where you are going, to see the boy. You shouldn't. Just turn around. Just go home. That is all. Please." Then Sam stepped away and he was gone. The entire appearance was over in moments. Faye took Sam's plea seriously. She turned around and walked back, heading home. The exact details of what happened have been left out to protect the identity of those involved, but it appears that Faye's boyfriend and his friends were arrested later that night for robbing a place. Sam had apparently stepped in to stop Faye from getting mixed up in this trouble. In stark contrast, Sam's next visit would be much longer. He was gone for a number of years. It was 1989. Faye was now very much an adult. Newly married, she was soon to leave the island to move into her new home with her husband on the mainland. While the final arrangements were being sorted, Faye was temporarily living with a friend still on the Isle of Wight, when she decided to go out for a walk on her own. As she was walking through a nearby field, something grabbed her attention. A hut. She said it almost looked like a sleek, futuristic-looking train carriage. Long, white, smooth, but strangely with a roof made of corrugated iron that was slightly bowed, giving the top a strong contrast to the sleekness of the rest of the structure. It stood out because it looked so out of place, like it had just been dropped there. Then she saw him, standing outside the hut, just like he had all those years before when she first met him. He looked more like he had done on their previous encounters. The same painted face, the same odd clothing. He invited her in for tea. Inside there was a table, 2 chairs and a strange device that kind of looked like a kettle, but wasn't. It was light inside, but she couldn't tell where the source of light was coming from. Sam and Faye sat down, and he proceeded to pour her a cup of tea into a cup that looked like porcelain, but was soft and pliable when she picked it up. The tea smelt of herbs, but she couldn't say what they were. Still, it tasted sweet and comforting. She said they then spoke for a long time, but much like her other encounters with Sam, her memory of it isn't crystal clear. She just remembers bits and pieces of their conversations. She would describe this phenomenon as a sort of soft forgetting, like waking up from a vivid dream. Some details remained, but others just seemed to fade away quickly after they happened. One thing she did note though, was that Sam said the Berlin Wall would fall, which it did later that year. This wasn't the first time he had alluded to this event happening. It seemed to be an important thing to Sam. Towards the end of their conversation, Sam informed Faye that he would only see her one more time, and that last time would be at the end. Finally, Faye asked him where he was from, and Sam gave a very Sam answer. He said he was from this place, but different. Sam took her back outside the hut. She said goodbye to him and Sam raised his hand to wave. Faye began to walk away. When she looked back, Sam and the hut were gone. She hasn't seen Sam since, but she knows she will. One day. One last time. So I kind of touched on it earlier, but let's talk about where this story has come from. Initially, this update was brought to my attention by one of you leaving me a comment on my Sam episode. To begin with, I was very skeptical. My thought was that we obviously know so little about the identities of Faye and her father, that it would be very easy for anyone to claim to be her. But regardless, I wanted to know more. So I found out that Paul Wilson had done an interview with the Modern Fairy Sightings podcast, and I listened to that. Prior to that, he had also had a similar conversation on the AP Strange show, and instantly I felt this was more interesting than I had initially thought. As I mentioned before, Paul is a writer and folklorist who lives on the Isle of Wight, and has written a great deal about the history and folklore of the island. He claims that he has been interested in the Sandown Clown case since he was a child, when his father told him the story as they walked past the golf course. Over the years, he has attempted to try and learn the identity of Faye, but with no luck. He says he's been contacted by a few people over the years that claim to be her, but they offered little to no additional information than what was present in the Before article, and some seemed more interested in getting money or attention from this case, which seemed at odds with the prior confidentiality that the family were insistent on. This was until around 2019, when someone got in touch claiming to be the child of Faye, and that she wanted to speak to Paul. Paul met the woman at her home, and she showed him a box of around 60 pages of documents. Among them were the original sketches of Sam, a long-lost magazine article that predates the Before article, what looks like handwritten back and forth correspondence between Mr. Y and Before, letters to the MOD UFO desk, and most interestingly of all, what is presented as the original notebook Sam apparently had, still water damaged and containing the famous line, "Hello, and I am all colours, Sam." The notebook hasn't been written in since Sam jotted that down. In his interviews, Paul reveals that seemingly Sam also drew a number of doodles in the book, drawings of trees and rocks in a very simple style, but also strange symbols that he likened to spirograph but hand-drawn. This supposed Faye then went on to tell Paul about all her other encounters. Paul says there is a reason she has come forward now after all this time, but he wasn't able to explain why. There's quite a few details that Paul is unwilling to give up in his interviews, which is simultaneously frustrating but also understandable. It seems that if this is the real Faye, she is still very concerned about her identity being kept secret, both for herself and her family. So any details that could give away that information is being kept away from the public eye. He was able to see the documents, but Faye obviously did not want him to take the originals. So instead he has scanned a lot of them and made transcripts of his interviews, but as it stands these are not available online yet. So far, Paul has held 2 talks on the Isle of Wight, sharing more details about Faye and Mr. Y's experiences, with a third scheduled for later in the year. At the time of writing this, the second talk is scheduled for a couple of days' time, and will apparently be recorded and put up on YouTube. So if this is out already, I'll provide a link for you all to see it. So, is all of this real? Is this really Faye? Can Paul A.T. Wilson be trusted? Or is this simply a case of people trying to involve themselves in a now beloved piece of strange history? Well, Paul himself says this could be a hoax, but you have to question why. He said that if the documents are fake, then someone has gone through a lot of effort to make them seem convincing. And to what gain? Paul himself is a folklorist. Much like me, his primary interest is the story, not the actual proof of if Sam is real or not. So if the story is true or not, it doesn't really affect him in any way. This Faye is not making any money from this, nor is she getting any wider attention. Paul has put on talks, so obviously is benefiting from this in some way, but he also plans to put these talks up for everyone to view on YouTube, and has said that if he were to write a book on the subject, that he would make sure a copy were available to download for free. The primary goal of both of these people seems to be to get the story out there, rather than any sort of personal gain. If all we had were the claims by Faye, then this would be much easier to dismiss, but the work that has apparently gone into the documents adds an air of believability that this could be the real person. Although, even if she is the real Faye, I'm not sure anything here gets us closer to understanding the mystery of Sam. If anything, it opens up so many new riddles. Let's go with the more skeptical side first. While the documents potentially prove that Faye and her father were real people who claim to have experienced something extraordinary, they do not in any way prove that the encounters really happened. The documents have also so far only been shown at Paul's talks, and the wider public hasn't had a chance to really pore over exactly what he has. When this does happen, it may allow us to really get an idea of if these could be genuine or not. There is also a comment on both podcasts I mentioned that seems to cast some doubt on Paul's reliability in this case. Although it's worth noting, it doesn't feel like a big smoking gun that discredits this case or anything, simply making a point that it feels fairly unbelievable and questioning a few details, but I thought it was still worth mentioning. Paul states that the handwriting in the notebook doesn't match Mr. Y's handwriting, but that doesn't mean someone else couldn't have written it. Mr. Y apparently wrote for years about being followed by the lights in the sky. Paul also makes mention these encounters over time turned darker and more sinister. This is an evolving story, and he hasn't got into the Mr. Y encounters fully yet. Apparently he plans to present these later in the year, but the skeptical view of this could point to Mr. Y being a very paranoid and potentially delusional individual. I don't buy into the idea that his claims were a deliberate hoax as such, but that doesn't mean they are true either. Maybe this man truly did believe that something otherworldly was out to get him. Maybe his daughter picked up on elements of this over the course of her childhood, and that combined with her childish imagination conjured up the story of Sam. Again, maybe she wasn't lying as such, but did have an encounter with a strange man that she has turned into something more fantastical. I think that could explain the initial encounter, but the subsequent ones make that idea a little more difficult. But of course, we don't know Faye. We have no idea what she's like as a person, her reliability as a narrator, her mental capacity. Faye would never report any of her subsequent encounters to anyone, but she did discuss it with her father. Seemingly, they both decided to keep what was happening to them throughout their lives to themselves after the Bufora article. Maybe they didn't think it was taken seriously enough and decided it wasn't worth trying to convince others. But as has always been the case with Sam, the more interesting part of this story is the fantastical side. This is a story that has always had virtually no evidence behind it, just the claims of two children and a father. So why would anyone take it seriously? Well, I think in part we all enjoy it just because of how weird it is, and in an odd way, that strangeness makes it feel a little bit more real. It's all the little details about his speech, his appearance, the strange elements like the decorations in his hut, the trick with the berries, the pliable cups, his apparent ability to temporarily seem more like a normal person when needed. It just doesn't really fit into any of the common tropes you see so often in supposed paranormal encounters. Even the characters in this story don't create a cohesive narrative between them. Mr. Y seems very focused on the UFO aspects. He sees UFOs. He thinks UFOs are following him, and continues to believe this throughout his entire life. He even reports his daughter's encounter to a UFO publication, and refers to Sam as an alien. But Faye does none of this. There is no UFO in her original encounter, nor the later ones. Certainly there are elements that echo stories of abductions, but she never seems to go down this route too heavily. Faye at the time did, and according to Paul still does, refer to Sam as a ghost. She also sees him as a kind of guardian angel-like character in her life. The boy in her original story is scared. Her father is scared. But Faye just seems to accept Sam as a part of her life. Then there are Sam's claims of him being from this place but different. In Faye's accounts of her encounters with Sam, it makes him feel more like a traveller from another dimension. Many have compared him to stories of encounters with fairies that have been baked into the historical folklore of our country forever. I opened my initial video on Sam with a quote from John Keel, and it still feels so relevant here. He famously wrote, "They are not from outer space. There is no need for them to be. They have always been here." Paul revealed in his conversations across the two podcasts that since coming out with this story, more people have contacted him. Not with stories of Sam as such, but claims of encounters that echo those of Faye's. Could this all just be a hoax? Perhaps. But that has always been the case with the Sandown Clown story. Maybe this isn't another chapter in the story of All Colours Sam. Maybe the story we've known and loved for so many years was nothing more than a prologue. Maybe there is much more to this story than we could have ever possibly imagined. That's all for this entry into the tape library. As a general rule, I tend to not jump onto trending topics on the show. One of the reasons I typically prefer to tackle older cases is that you have the benefit of being able to look back on it from above, rather than being caught up in the narrative that is unfolding. But for this, I had to make an exception. Sam feels like such an important character in the world of this show. It's one of my most popular episodes of all time, and is a story that I am personally obsessed with. So once I realised there was a little more to this claim of additional encounters, I had to get involved. I'll be keeping an eye on what happens next, and maybe we'll have to do a part 3 on Sam in the future. I'm going to include links to both of the podcasts I mentioned here. If you want to hear what Paul has to say for himself, I'd strongly recommend checking those out. They're really good interviews. And as I said, I'll include a link if Paul's presentation is online by the time I publish this. Paul has another talk coming up in November at the Bembridge Fort, in which he apparently plans to delve more into the Mr. Y stuff. I would love to attend myself, but I don't think I'm going to be able to, annoyingly. But if you are able to get to the Isle of Wight in November, I'll include a link to that as well. So, as always, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you think this really could be Faye? And what do you make of these new encounters? Let me know in the comments below. We obviously had some fairly big news regarding the tape library recently. Many of you will already be aware, but the show is now part of the Spectavision radio network. I just want to take a moment to talk about that and what it means for the show, if you'll indulge me a little bit longer. For those who don't know, Spectavision is a production company formed by Elijah Wood and producers Daniel Noah and Josh Waller. They are responsible for some great pieces of weird cinema, like A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, Colour Out of Space, Mandy, and the absolute masterpiece that is The Greasy Strangler. I'm a massive film nerd, so I've been a huge fan of what these guys are doing for a long time. Last year they launched Spectavision Radio, which was their foray into the world of podcasts, and they instantly signed up a really impressive roster of people, from filmmakers like Mike Flanagan and Joe Dante, to names big in the supernatural and esoteric worlds like Greg and Dana Newkirk, Mitch Horowitz and Jim Perry. I've been asked to join podcast networks a few times and really had no interest in doing it, but when Spectavision got in touch it felt very different. This was a company I was already a big fan of, and they were amassing a roster of talent that I thought was really impressive. This was a great group of talented individuals, and I was honoured to be invited to get involved. They wanted it to be an artist-led group and were very open to keeping things weird. More importantly, it was being run by people who were creative individuals themselves, not just a faceless business. But what does this mean for the show? Well, not a lot really as far as you guys are concerned. Spectavision Radio are going to be helping me out with the podcast side of things. This is one of the reasons you can now see my videos on Spotify, and you may hear me promoting shows from time to time on their network, but I would happily do that anyway. They've got stuff like Knife Point Horror. That show was the soundtrack to my long journeys home from my office job years ago, so a lot of their podcasts have a special place in my heart. Beyond that, nothing will be changing. I am the sole person behind the creative side of the tape library, and that remains the case. So don't worry, this is still going to be exactly the same as it always was. I wouldn't have agreed to join if any of the decisions being made on the direction of the tape library were being taken away from me. Long story short, the tape library is now part of the Spectavision Radio network. They are really cool people promoting really cool shows. Nothing regarding the actual content of the tape library is changing, and I'm really excited to be working with these guys. I know shows joining networks sometimes lead to things you like about that show changing, so I just wanted to set any concerns aside here. This is my creepy little baby still. Well, it's getting late and I've kept you here long enough. As always, if you are new here, please do click subscribe. And if you're listening to the podcast version, please do leave the show a rating. Although, if it's anything less than 5 stars, I may send a certain dole after you. That's all for tonight. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams.